The typewriter keys struck the paper with a rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing to Officer Patricia Williams during her 23 years on the force. Each letter appeared with that distinctive serif font of the old IBM Selectric, creating words that would outlast the memories of those who wrote them. The report she was composing at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October would join the thousands of others that filled the precinct's filing systems. Each one a careful translation of human chaos into ordered documentation. The incident room on the second floor of the central precinct had taken on that particular quality of late-night institutional spaces, where fluorescent lights hummed against the silence and the coffee grew thick and bitter in pots that had been brewing since the evening shift began. Officer Williams sat at desk number 7, the same desk she had occupied for the past 8 years of night shifts, her fingers moving across the keys with the unconscious precision that came from typing thousands of similar reports. The case she was documenting involved what the preliminary notes described as a domestic disturbance on Maple Street. But as Officer Williams translated her handwritten notes into the formal language of the report, the story became something more complex and nuanced than those simple words suggested. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez had called the police at 11:43 p.m. reporting that her neighbor was playing music too loudly and had ignored her request to lower the volume. Officer Williams had responded to the call along with her partner, Officer James Crawford, finding a situation that required more patience than authority. The neighbor in question was Mr. Antonio Silva, a widower in his 70s who had recently begun learning to play the guitar as a way of coping with the loneliness that had settled over his life since his wife's death 6 months earlier. He had been practicing in his living room, unaware that the thin walls of the duplex carried every note into Mrs. Vasquez's bedroom, where she was trying to sleep before her early morning shift at the hospital. The report documented their conversation with both parties. How Officer Crawford had listened to Mrs. Vasquez's concerns about her need for sleep given her demanding work schedule, while Officer Williams had sat with Mr. Silva as he explained how the guitar had become his only source of comfort during the long evenings when the silence of his empty house became unbearable. Neither neighbor had been unreasonable in their position, but their needs had come into conflict in the particular way that happened when people were pressed close together by the economics of urban housing. Officer Williams typed slowly, choosing her words with the care that came from understanding that these reports would become part of the official record, read by supervisors and prosecutors and possibly judges who would use them to understand what had actually happened during those late-night hours when most of the city was asleep. The language of police reports had its own rhythm and requirements, a formal structure that transformed the immediate emotion and confusion of real events into something that could be filed, referenced, and understood by people who had not been present. The resolution she documented had been simple but effective. Mr. Silva had agreed to limit his guitar practice to earlier evening hours, while Mrs. Vasquez had offered to provide him with information about a senior center music program where he could practice with other beginning musicians. Officer Williams had included their contact information in her report, noting that both parties had expressed satisfaction with the arrangement and had shaken hands before the officers left the scene. This kind of resolution was typical of the calls that came during the night shift, when the city's normal rhythms slowed down enough for people to address their problems through conversation rather than confrontation. Officer Williams had learned over the years that many situations that seemed like law enforcement matters were actually opportunities for mediation, moments when a police officer's authority could be used to create space for understanding rather than simply to impose order through force. She finished the Silva Vasquez report and moved on to the next case in her stack, an incident involving graffiti that had been discovered on the side of the First National Bank building during the morning security check. The night security guard, Mr. Robert Kim, had found 3 words spray-painted in red letters across the brick wall facing the alley. Remember Sarah Martinez. Officer Williams had been called to document the vandalism, but her investigation had revealed a story that complicated the simple designation of the incident as property damage. Sarah Martinez had been a local civil rights activist who had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, on the anniversary of which someone had apparently chosen to commemorate her memory through unauthorized public art. The report documented Officer Williams' conversation with Mr. Kim, who had provided details about the timing of the discovery and the exact location of the graffiti. She had also spoken with the bank's day manager, Mrs. Helen Foster, who had been primarily concerned about the cost of removing the paint and preventing future incidents. The building was located in the downtown business district, where property owners were particularly sensitive about maintaining professional appearances. However, Officer Williams had also taken the time to research Sarah Martinez, consulting newspaper archives and speaking with longtime residents who remembered her work with the local chapter of the NAACP. Young woman had been instrumental in organizing peaceful protests that had led to changes in housing policies and employment practices throughout the city. Her death had been mourned by many people who credited her with making significant improvements in opportunities for minority residents. The investigation had led Officer Williams to contact several people who had known Sarah Martinez personally, not to identify the person responsible for the graffiti, but to understand the context that had motivated someone to commemorate her memory in this particular way. Mrs. Dorothy Washington, who had worked closely with Sarah Martinez on several community initiatives, had explained that the anniversary of the activists' death had become an informal day of remembrance among people who had been inspired by her work. Officer Williams' report documented her recommendation that the bank consider leaving the graffiti in place temporarily, perhaps working with community members to create a more formal memorial that would serve the same purpose while respecting property rights. She had noted that the message appeared to be more commemorative than destructive, and that removing it might create more community tension than leaving it alone. The final disposition of the case had been left to the bank's management, but Officer Williams had included contact information for Mrs. Washington and other community members who had expressed interest in finding an appropriate way to honor Sarah Martinez's memory. Her report concluded with an observation that property crime sometimes reflected deeper community needs that could be addressed through cooperation rather than enforcement. Moving through her stack of cases, Officer Williams pulled the notes for another incident that had required careful documentation. A call had come in at 1:15 a.m. from the manager of the Starlight Diner, REPOR, Tianyin, that a customer was refusing to pay for his meal and had become argumentative when asked to settle his bill. When Officer Williams and Officer Crawford had arrived at the scene, they had found a situation that was more complex than simple theft of services. The customer was Mr. David Chun, a middle-aged man who had ordered coffee and pie but had become confused when the bill arrived, insisting that he had already paid and becoming agitated when the waitress, Mrs. Linda Murphy, had gently explained that no payment had been received. Officer Williams had recognized signs that Mr. Chun might be experiencing the early stages of dementia. Noting his difficulty following the conversation and his apparent genuine confusion about the situation, rather than treating the incident as a criminal matter, Officer Williams had taken time to speak privately with Mr. Chun, asking questions that helped her understand his mental state and his ability to care for himself. He had been able to provide his name and address, but had shown confusion about the date and had difficulty explaining how he had gotten to the diner or where he had intended to go after his meal. Officer Williams' report documented her decision to contact Mr. Chun's emergency contact, a phone number she found in his wallet along with sufficient money to pay for his meal. His daughter, Mrs. Angela Chun Roberts, had been grateful for the call and had explained that her father had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease but had been resistant to accepting limitations on his independence. Report described how Officer Williams had waited with Mr. Chun until his daughter arrived, ensuring that he felt comfortable and safe while avoiding any suggestion that he was in trouble. Mrs. Chun Roberts had paid for her father's meal and had thanked both officers for their patience and understanding, noting that she had been struggling to balance her father's need for autonomy with concerns about his safety. The diner manager, Mr. Frank Kowalski, had initially wanted to ban Mr. Chun from the restaurant to prevent future incidents, but Officer Williams had worked with him to develop an alternative approach. They had agreed that if Mr. Chun returned to the diner, staff would discreetly contact his daughter rather than confronting him about payment issues, recognizing that his confusion was a medical condition rather than an attempt to defraud the business. Officer Williams typed this resolution into her report, noting how small acts of understanding could prevent situations from escalating into unnecessary confrontations. The case illustrated the kind of problem-solving that characterized much of police work during the quiet hours of the night shift, when there was time to look beyond immediate appearances to understand the human circumstances that created apparent violations of law and order. Her next report dealt with an incident at Riverside Park, where the overnight security guard had discovered someone sleeping on a bench despite POSTED signs prohibiting overnight camping. Officer Williams had responded to the call expecting to issue a citation for violating park regulations, but had instead found herself documenting a more complicated situation involving housing insecurity and mental health challenges. The person sleeping in the park was Ms. Jennifer Walsh, a woman in her 40s who had been evicted from her apartment 2 weeks earlier when her disability benefits had been temporarily suspended due to a paperwork error. She had been staying with friends when possible, but had found herself with nowhere to go on this particular night when her usual arrangements had fallen through. Officer Williams' report documented her conversation with Ms. Walsh, who had been coherent and cooperative, but clearly exhausted and discouraged by her circumstances. She had explained that she had been trying to resolve the benefits issue through proper channels, but that the bureaucratic process was moving slowly while her immediate need for shelter remained urgent. Rather than issuing a citation that would have added to Ms. Walsh's problems without solving them, Officer Williams had spent time researching available resources that might provide immediate assistance. She had contacted the city's emergency housing hotline, learning that temporary shelter space was available at a facility across town, and had arranged for transportation to ensure that Ms. Walsh could access the service safely. The report included detailed information about the resources that Officer Williams had identified, both for use in future similar situations and to demonstrate that the incident had been resolved through social services rather than criminal sanctions. She had noted that Ms. Walsh had expressed gratitude for the assistance and had provided contact information for follow-up to ensure that her housing situation was stabilized. The park security guard, Mr. Thomas Rivera, had been impressed by Officer Williams' approach to the situation, commenting that he had expected the woman to be arrested rather than assisted. Officer Williams had explained that effective law enforcement often involved connecting people with appropriate services rather than simply enforcing regulations, particularly in cases where violations resulted from circumstances beyond the individual's control. As she completed the park incident report, Officer Williams reflected on how the nature of police work changed during the overnight hours, when the usual pace of urban life slowed enough to allow for more thoughtful responses to human problems. The night shift brought different kinds of calls, often involving people who were struggling with loneliness, mental health challenges, or economic pressures that became more acute during the quiet hours when normal support systems were less available. Her next case involved a noise complaint from the Grandview Apartments, where residents had reported loud arguments coming from Unit 3B throughout the evening. Officer Williams and Officer Crawford had responded to find a situation that required delicate handling, as the arguing involved an elderly couple dealing with the stress of caring for their adult son who had recently returned home after being hospitalized for psychiatric treatment. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Martinez had been caring for their son Thomas, who was recovering from a psychotic episode that had required several weeks of inpatient treatment. Thomas had been released to their care with medications and outpatient treatment requirements, but the adjustment to living together again had created tensions that occasionally erupted into arguments loud enough to disturb neighboring units. Officer Williams' report documented the complexity of the situation, noting that the family was dealing with genuine mental health challenges that required patience and professional support rather than law enforcement intervention. Mrs. Martinez had explained that Thomas sometimes became agitated when his routine was disrupted, and that their attempts to help him follow his treatment plan sometimes led to disagreements that escalated into shouting. The officers had worked with the family to develop strategies for managing conflicts before they became loud enough to disturb neighbors, including identifying early warning signs of Thomas's agitation and establishing a protocol for contacting his mental health caseworker when tensions began to rise. Officer Williams had also provided information about support groups for families dealing with mental health challenges, recognizing that the Martinez family needed ongoing resources rather than simply immediate crisis intervention. The apartment building manager, Mrs. Susan Clark, had been understanding about the situation once she learned about the family's circumstances, agreeing to work with them to address noise concerns through communication rather than eviction proceedings. Officer Williams had documented this cooperation in her report, noting how community understanding could prevent housing instability that might worsen mental health challenges. These cases represented the kind of police work that rarely made headlines but formed the foundation of community safety and stability. Officer Williams had learned over her years on the night shift that effective law enforcement often involved recognizing when situations required social services, mental health resources, or simply human compassion rather than criminal sanctions. Her final report of the shift dealt with an incident at Murphy's Corner store, where the night clerk had activated the silent alarm when two teenagers had entered the store wearing dark clothing and moving in what he interpreted as a suspicious manner. Officer Williams had responded quickly, expecting to find a robbery in progress, but had instead discovered a misunderstanding based on assumptions and fear rather than actual criminal activity. The teenagers were Marcus Johnson and his cousin Kevin Williams, both 16 years old and returning home from a late movie when they had stopped at the store to buy snacks. They had been wearing dark hoodies and had been speaking quietly to each other as they browsed the aisles, behavior that the clerk, Mr. Eugene McCarthy, had interpreted as suspicious given recent reports of convenience store robberies in neighboring districts. Officer Williams' report documented how she had interviewed all parties to understand what had actually occurred, taking care to treat the teenagers with respect while also acknowledging the clerk's legitimate concerns about store security. Marcus and Kevin had been cooperative and polite, providing identification and explaining their presence in the store without defensiveness or hostility. The investigation revealed that no crime had been committed or attempted, but Officer Williams had used the incident as an opportunity to discuss how misunderstandings could be prevented through better communication between store employees and customers. She had worked with Mr. McCarthy to develop protocols for distinguishing between genuinely suspicious behavior and normal customer activity, emphasizing the importance of observing actual actions rather than making assumptions based on appearance. The report also documented Officer Williams' conversation with the teenagers about how their behavior might be perceived by others, not to suggest that they had done anything wrong, but to help them understand how they could avoid future misunderstandings. She had emphasized that they had every right to shop in any store without harassment, while also providing practical advice about navigating situations where they might encounter suspicion or prejudice. Mr. McCarthy had apologized to the teenagers for his overreaction, and Officer Williams had documented his commitment to undergo additional training about recognizing actual criminal behavior versus normal customer activity. The store's owner had also agreed to review security protocols to ensure that alarm systems were used appropriately rather than in response to unfounded suspicions. As she completed this final report of her shift, Officer Williams reflected on how documentation served not just as a record of police activity, but as a tool for learning and improvement. Each report became part of the department's institutional memory, providing lessons that could inform future training and policy development. The typing had taken her through the quiet hours before dawn, when the city began its slow transition from night to morning. Other officers were completing their own reports at desks throughout the room, creating a collective record of the night's events that would become part of the vast archive of human experience that law enforcement accumulated one incident at a time. Officer Williams gathered her completed reports and prepared them for filing, ensuring that each one contained the information necessary for supervisors, prosecutors, and other officials who might need to understand what had occurred during these overnight hours. The reports would join thousands of others in the department's filing systems, becoming part of the permanent record of how law enforcement actually functioned in the daily life of the community. The morning shift began arriving as Officer Williams completed her paperwork, bringing fresh energy and different perspectives to the ongoing work of maintaining order and safety in the city. But the foundation of that work remained the same careful documentation that transformed the chaos and complexity of human behavior into ordered records that could be understood, analyzed, and learned from by future generations of officers. She signed her final report and placed it in the appropriate filing tray, then gathered her personal belongings and prepared to leave the precinct. Outside, the city was beginning to wake up, with early commuters and delivery trucks starting the daily cycle of activity that would generate new calls, new incidents, and new reports for the officers who would spend the coming day and night translating human experience into the formal language of law enforcement. The reports she had written would outlast her shift, her career, and perhaps even her lifetime, becoming part of the permanent record of how a community had worked together to address the challenges and conflicts that arose when people lived in close proximity to each other. Each report represented not just documentation of specific incidents, but evidence of the ongoing human effort to create order and understanding in a world that constantly threatened to slip into chaos and confusion. Asterisk. The basement storage facility of the Metropolitan Police Department stretched beneath 3 city blocks, a labyrinth of corridors lined with filing cabinets that held the accumulated weight of 47 years of criminal investigations. Detective Michael Torres had been assigned to the archive digitization project, a task that required him to spend his days in this underground world where artificial light hummed against concrete walls and the air carried the particular scent of aging. Paper and metal drawer slides, each cabinet told its own story through the gradual changes in filing systems, report formats, and the quality of paper used to document the endless stream of human behavior that passed through the criminal justice system. The oldest files, stored in the deepest sections of the archive, had been typed on manual typewriters using carbon paper, creating documents where each keystroke had required deliberate pressure and where corrections appeared as small white patches of correction fluid that had yellowed with age. Detective Torres opened cabinet 1952C, revealing files from the autumn of that year when the city had been smaller and the police department had operated with less than half its current staff. The manila folders inside hung in perfect rows, their tabs labeled with case numbers written in fountain pen ink that had faded from black to brown over the decades. Each folder contained the complete documentation of investigations that had once consumed weeks or months of police attention but had long since been resolved and forgotten by everyone except the filing system. First file he pulled dealt with a burglary at Henderson's hardware store, a business that had occupied the corner of 5th and Main Streets until urban renewal projects had demolished the entire block in the 1970s. The investigating officer, Detective William Murphy, had documented the case with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized police work from that era, when investigations moved at a pace determined by the limitations of communication technology and transportation, rather than the urgency of modern expectations. The burglary had occurred on expectations. Tuesday night in October, discovered Wednesday morning when the store owner, Mr. James Henderson, had arrived to find his front door standing open and several items missing from his inventory. Detective Murphy's initial report described the scene with careful precision, noting the condition of the lock, the position of displaced merchandise, and the apparent path that the intruder had taken through the store. What struck Detective Torres as he read through the file was the thoroughness of the investigation that had followed. Detective Murphy had interviewed not just Mr. Henderson, but also neighboring business owners, residents of nearby apartments, and even the night shift workers at the bus depot 3 blocks away, who might have observed unusual activity during the relevant time period. Each interview had been documented in handwritten notes that showed the careful attention to detail that characterized police work before the pressure of increasing caseloads had required more efficient methods. The case had been solved through what the final report described as persistent shoe leather investigation, a phrase that captured the era's reliance on face-to-face conversation and physical evidence rather than electronic surveillance or database searches. Detective Murphy had discovered that the burglar had left behind a distinctive footprint in the mud outside the store's back door, leading him to systematically check the shoes of known local troublemakers until he found a match. The suspect had turned out to be Tommy Kowalski, a 19-year-old who had been struggling to find steady employment since returning from military service. The stolen items, which included a flashlight, some hand tools, and a small amount of cash from the register, had been recovered from Tommy's boarding house room along with evidence of his growing desperation over his financial situation. Detective Torres found the resolution of the case particularly interesting for its focus on addressing underlying problems rather than simply punishing criminal behavior. Detective Murphy had worked with Mr. Henderson to develop a restitution plan that allowed Tommy to work off his debt through part-time employment at the hardware store, providing both compensation for the stolen goods and an opportunity for steady income that might prevent future crimes. The file contained letters from several months later indicating that the arrangement had been successful. Tommy Kowalski had become a full-time employee of Henderson's hardware and had eventually saved enough money to rent his own apartment and begin building a stable life. Mr. Henderson had written to Detective Murphy, expressing his satisfaction with the outcome, noting that he had gained a reliable employee while also contributing to the rehabilitation of a young man who had simply needed an opportunity to prove himself. This kind of restorative approach to minor crimes appeared frequently in the files from that era, suggesting a different philosophy about the purpose of law enforcement that prioritized community stability over punishment. Detective Torres made careful notes about these cases for the digitization project, recognizing that they represented valuable insights into alternative approaches to criminal justice that might inform current policy discussions. Moving deeper into the cabinet, he found a file dealing with a missing person case that had stretched across Several months in 1952, Mrs. Dorothy Fleming, a 42-year-old widow, had disappeared from her apartment on Elm Street, leaving behind no indication of where she might have gone or why she might have chosen to leave. The investigating detective, Lieutenant Robert Chun, had approached the case with the same methodical patience that characterized Detective Murphy's burglary investigation. The initial report documented Lieutenant Chun's systematic search of Mrs. Fleming's apartment, looking not for signs of struggle or foul play, but for clues about her state of mind and possible destinations. Her belongings had been left in good order, with no indication of hasty departure. But several personal items were missing, including a small suitcase and her deceased husband's photograph. Lieutenant Chun had interviewed Mrs. Fleming's neighbors, co-workers at the textile factory where she had been employed, and members of her church congregation, gradually building a picture of a woman who had been struggling with depression and isolation in the months following her husband's death from tuberculosis. Several people had mentioned that she had spoken about wanting to visit her sister in California, though no one knew whether she had actually made contact with family members there. Asterisk. The investigation had required extensive correspondence with police departments throughout the western states, a process that took weeks in an era when long-distance telephone calls were expensive and most communication occurred through telegraph or mail. Lieutenant Chen had systematically contacted law enforcement agencies in every city where Mrs. Fleming might have traveled, providing descriptions and requesting assistance in locating someone who might not have wanted to be found. The breakthrough had come through a telegraph from the police department in Sacramento, California, where a woman matching Mrs. Fleming's description had been hospitalized after collapsing from exhaustion at the train station. She had been carrying identification but had been too disoriented to provide coherent information about her circumstances or destination. Lieutenant Chen had traveled to California personally to confirm the woman's identity and arrange for her safe return. A journey that the case file documented in detail, including travel expenses and the arrangements made for Mrs. Fleming's care during the trip home. The final reports indicated that she had indeed been attempting to reach her sister, but had become confused and lost during the long train journey west. Resolution of the case had involved not just Mrs. Fleming's physical return, but also arrangements for ongoing support to address the depression and isolation that had motivated her disappearance. Lieutenant Chen had worked with her church congregation and local social services to ensure that she received regular visits and assistance with daily tasks that had become overwhelming. In her widowed state, these old files revealed a different pace of police work, one that allowed for the kind of personal attention and follow-up that seemed almost luxurious by modern standards. Detective Torres found himself wondering whether current officers, pressed by heavy caseloads and administrative demands, had the time and resources necessary for the kind of comprehensive investigations that characterized these archived cases. He moved to another section of the cabinet, finding files from the winter of 1952 that dealt with what the cover sheets described as a wave of petty thefts in the downtown business district. Reading through the individual case reports, Detective Torres discovered that the thefts had actually been quite minor, involving small amounts of merchandise or cash taken from stores. During busy periods when proprietors were distracted by customers, the investigating team, led by Sergeant Frank Rodriguez, had approached the case as a pattern rather than treating each theft as an isolated incident. Their reports documented a systematic analysis of the timing, location, and method of each theft, looking for connections that might reveal the identity of the person responsible. The investigation had revealed that all the thefts had occurred during the lunch hour on weekdays, always in businesses located within a 6-block radius of the downtown area, and always involving items that could be easily concealed and quickly removed. The perpetrator had shown knowledge of each store's layout and peak business periods, suggesting someone who was familiar with the downtown business community. Sergeant Rodriguez and his team had spent weeks conducting what they called surveillance shopping, visiting the affected businesses during the relevant time periods and observing customer behavior, while also interviewing store employees about anyone who had been asking unusual questions or showing particular interest in store operations. The case had been solved when Mrs. Helen Murphy, who worked at Morrison's department store, had noticed a young woman who had been in the store several times during the past week, always during lunch hour, always examining merchandise carefully, but never making purchases. When the woman had returned and Mrs. Murphy had observed her concealing a small item in her coat, she had quietly notified store security rather than confronting the suspected shoplifter directly. The suspect had turned out to be Miss Patricia Wong, a 23-year-old office worker who had been taking small items from various stores to furnish her first apartment after moving to the city from a rural area. The thefts had not been motivated by need so much as by uncertainty about how to navigate urban shopping customs and embarrassment about her limited budget for household items. Sergeant Rodriguez had worked with the store owners and Miss Wong to develop a resolution that addressed both the immediate problem of the thefts and the underlying issues that had motivated them. Rather than pursuing criminal charges, the affected businesses had agreed to accept restitution, while also connecting Miss Wong with community resources that could help her adjust to city life. The case file included follow-up reports indicating that Miss Wong had become an active member of a young professionals group at her church and had developed friendships that provided both social support and practical advice about managing urban life on a limited budget. Several store owners had written letters commenting that the experience had made them more aware of how intimidating their businesses might seem to newcomers and had led them to train their employees to be more welcoming and helpful to customers who seemed uncertain or confused. These resolutions reflected a community-oriented approach to law enforcement that seemed to recognize crime is often symptomatic of larger social problems that could be addressed through cooperation and understanding, rather than simply punishment. Detective Torres noted the recurring theme of rehabilitation and community integration that appeared in case after case from this era. Deeper in the cabinet, he found a file dealing with vandalism at Roosevelt Elementary School, where someone had been breaking windows and damaging playground equipment during weekend nights throughout the spring of 1952. The investigating officer, Detective James Washington, had treated the case not as simple property damage, but as a puzzle that required understanding the motivation behind the destructive behavior. Detective Washington's reports documented his systematic investigation of the school environment, including interviews with teachers, custodial staff, and neighborhood residents who might have observed suspicious activity during the relevant time periods. He had also taken the unusual step of consulting with the school principal, Mrs. Margaret Thompson, about any recent changes in the school community that might have created tensions or conflicts. Investigation had revealed that the vandalism had begun shortly after the school board had announced plans to integrate the previously all-white elementary school with students from the predominantly African-American school across town. Detective Washington had recognized that the property damage might be connected to racial tensions surrounding the integration plan, requiring a more sensitive approach than typical vandalism cases. Working with school officials and community leaders, Detective Washington had organized neighborhood meetings to discuss the integration plans and address concerns that might be motivating the destructive behavior. The meetings had revealed strong opinions on both sides of the integration issue, but they had also created opportunities for dialogue that might prevent tensions from escalating into more serious conflicts. The vandalism had stopped after these community discussions, though Detective Washington's final report noted that no individual had been identified or arrested in connection with the property damage. His conclusion suggested that the meetings had served their purpose by providing legitimate channels for expressing opposition to integration policies, reducing the appeal of anonymous destructive acts as a form of protest. The case represented an early example of what would later be called community policing, recognizing that effective law enforcement sometimes required addressing social and political tensions, rather than simply responding to their criminal manifestations. Detective Washington's approach had prioritized community stability over individual arrests, focusing on prevention rather than punishment. Moving through the files chronologically, Detective Torres found a case from the summer of 1952 involving what the initial reports described as suspicious activity at the city reservoir. The night watchman, Mr. Albert Kowalski, had reported seeing lights near the water treatment facility during his rounds, leading to concerns about potential sabotage or contamination of the city's water supply. Detective Lieutenant Mary Foster had been assigned to investigate the reports, approaching the case with the thoroughness that characterized serious threats to public safety. Her investigation had included not just surveillance of the reservoir area, but also background checks on employees with access to the facility and consultations with federal authorities about potential national security implications. The investigation had revealed that the suspicious lights had been caused by a group of amateur astronomers who had been using the area around the reservoir as an observation site because of its distance from city lights and relatively clear views of the night sky. The astronomy club, led by Mr. David Chun, a local high school science teacher, had been meeting weekly to observe celestial events and had been using flashlights and lanterns to read star charts and operate their equipment. Detective Foster's report documented her conversation with Mr. Chun and other club members who had been unaware that their activities might be perceived as threatening or suspicious. They had chosen the reservoir area precisely because it seemed isolated and unlikely to disturb anyone, not realizing that their presence would be noticed by security personnel or reported to police. The resolution of the case had involved coordination between the astronomy club and reservoir security to establish protocols for legitimate scientific observation that would not trigger security concerns. Mr. Kowalski had been provided with information about the club's meeting schedule, while club members had agreed to notify facility security in advance of their observation sessions. Detective Foster's final report had noted that the incident illustrated the importance of communication between community groups and public safety officials, suggesting that many apparent security threats might be resolved through better coordination rather than enforcement action. The astronomy club had eventually been given formal permission to use a designated area near the reservoir for their observations, creating an arrangement that served both scientific education and public safety. These files from the early 1950s painted a picture of police work that was characterized by patience, thorough investigation, and creative problem-solving that often resulted in solutions that strengthened community relationships rather than simply resolving immediate problems. Detective Torres found himself impressed by the time and attention that officers from that era had been able to devote to understanding the context and implications of the cases they investigated. The filing system itself told part of the story, with its careful organization and detailed cross-referencing that allowed investigators to identify patterns and connections between apparently unrelated incidents. Each file contained not just the basic facts of individual cases, but also analysis and commentary that revealed the thinking processes of experienced officers who understood their work as part of a larger effort to maintain social stability and community cohesion. As Detective Torres continued through the cabinet, he found files dealing with cases that would seem almost quaint by modern standards, but that had been treated with the same seriousness and attention to detail that characterized investigations of major crimes. A report about teenagers gathering in the park after dark had been investigated as thoroughly as cases involving theft or vandalism, reflecting a different understanding of police responsibility that encompassed maintaining order and preventing problems rather than simply responding to crimes after they occurred. The archive represented more than just historical documentation. It was a record of different approaches to law enforcement that might offer insights for current challenges facing police departments. The officers whose work was preserved in these files had operated with different constraints and expectations, but their emphasis on community engagement and problem-solving remained relevant for contemporary policing strategies. Detective Torres made careful notes about the themes and approaches he observed in these old cases, recognizing that the digitization project offered an opportunity not just to preserve historical records, but also to learn from the accumulated wisdom of previous generations of law enforcement officers. The files contained lessons about patience, thoroughness, and the importance of understanding crime within its social context that remained applicable, regardless of changes in technology and procedure. The work of reading through these archived cases was slow and methodical, requiring the same kind of careful attention to detail that had characterized the original investigations. But Detective Torres found the process deeply satisfying, feeling connected to the long tradition of police officers who had dedicated their careers to understanding human behavior and finding ways to maintain order and safety in communities where people lived and worked together despite their differences and conflicts. The Basement Archive would continue to preserve these stories for future generations of officers and researchers, maintaining the institutional memory that connected current police work to its historical foundations. Each file represented not just documentation of specific incidents, but evidence of the ongoing human effort to create systems of justice and order that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their fundamental commitment to protecting and serving the community. Old Courthouse on 7th Street had been abandoned for 15 years, its grand limestone facade weathered, but still imposing against the night sky. Detective Catherine Reed walked through its darkened corridors with the kind of reverence reserved for sacred spaces, her flashlight beam revealing glimpses of carved woodwork and marble, columns that spoke of an era when justice had been dispensed with ceremonial gravity and architectural grandeur. She was conducting a final security sweep before the building's scheduled demolition, a task that had brought her into contact with the physical remnants of countless trials and hearings that had shaped the legal history of the city. Each courtroom held its own particular atmosphere, the accumulated weight of testimony and deliberation that had filled these spaces for nearly a century, before modern efficiency had demanded newer, more functional facilities. Courtroom 3A had been the domain of Judge Harold Morrison for 32 years. From 1943 until his retirement in 1975, the judge's bench still dominated the room, its dark mahogany surface worn smooth by decades of use, though papers and law books had long since been removed to the new courthouse across town. Detective Reed could imagine the countless mornings when Judge Morrison had taken his place behind this bench, calling court to session with the traditional words that marked the beginning of legal proceedings. The gallery had accommodated hundreds of families, witnesses, and spectators over the years, each wooden pew bearing the subtle marks of human presence and anxiety that characterized places where momentous decisions were made. Detective Reed had reviewed the court records before her visit, learning that courtroom 3A had been the site of both routine proceedings and landmark Cases that had established important precedents in local jurisprudence. 1. Case that had particularly captured her attention involved the 1963 trial of Robert Chun, a local businessman accused of embezzling funds from the Community Development Corporation, where he had served as treasurer. The trial had stretched across 3 weeks, with testimony that revealed not just the specific allegations against Chen, but also the complex web of relationships and obligations that characterize small-town business and politics. Judge Morrison had presided over the case with the careful attention to procedure that had characterized his entire career, ensuring that both prosecution and defense had adequate opportunity to present their evidence while maintaining the dignity and decorum that he believed essential to the proper functioning of the justice system. The court transcripts revealed his patient guidance of proceedings that often became emotionally charged as community members testified about their trust in Chun and their shock at the alleged betrayal. The case had ultimately resulted in Chun's conviction on several counts of embezzlement, but Judge Morrison's sentencing had reflected his understanding of the complex circumstances that had led to the crime. Rather than imposing the maximum penalty allowed by law, he had structured a sentence that included restitution, community service, and probation supervision, designed to allow Chun to rebuild his life while making amends to those he had wronged. The sentencing hearing had been held in this same courtroom, with Chun's family and supporters filling the gallery, alongside members of the community who had been affected by his actions. Judge Morrison's remarks, preserved in the court record, had emphasized the importance of accountability, while also recognizing the potential for redemption that existed even in cases involving serious breaches of trust. Detective Reed could almost hear the echo of those proceedings as she stood in the empty courtroom, imagining the weight of emotion that had filled this space during moments when people's futures hung in the balance. The architecture itself seemed designed to inspire respect for the legal process, with its high ceiling and formal arrangement creating an atmosphere that emphasized the seriousness of the decisions being made. Moving to the second floor, she found courtroom 2B, which had been used primarily for family court proceedings under the supervision of Judge Margaret Washington. This smaller courtroom had handled custody disputes, adoption hearings, and juvenile cases that required a more intimate setting than the grand courtrooms used for major criminal trials. The records indicated that Judge Washington had been particularly innovative in her approach to family law, often scheduling informal conferences in her chambers rather than conducting all proceedings in the formal courtroom setting. She had believed that many family disputes could be resolved more effectively through mediation and counseling than through adversarial legal proceedings, a philosophy that had influenced family court practice throughout the region. Asterisk. One case that exemplified Judge Washington's approach had involved the custody of 3 children following their parents' contentious divorce in 1968, rather than simply deciding custody based on the conflicting claims of the parents. Judge Washington had appointed a court-appointed social worker to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the family situation and make recommendations based on the children's best interests rather than the parents' legal arguments. The proceedings had stretched across several months, with multiple hearings that had focused on developing a custody arrangement that would minimize trauma for the children while ensuring that both parents maintained meaningful relationships with their offspring. Judge Washington had used the courtroom for formal hearings, but had conducted much of the actual problem-solving in less formal settings that encouraged cooperation rather than confrontation. The final custody agreement had included innovative provisions for shared parenting time and decision-making authority that had been unusual for that era but had proved successful in maintaining family relationships despite the divorce. The case had been studied by family law experts and had influenced changes in custody law that emphasized children's welfare over parents' rights. Detective Reed found herself moved by the evidence of Judge Washington's commitment to finding solutions that served human needs rather than simply following legal precedents. The courtroom had been designed for formal proceedings, but the judge had used it as part of a larger effort to help families navigate difficult transitions with dignity and hope for the future. The building's detention area, located in the basement, told a different story about the criminal justice system's approach to those who had been arrested but not yet tried. The holding cells had been designed with attention to both security and basic human dignity, with adequate lighting, ventilation, and sanitation facilities that reflected the principle that pretrial detention should not constitute punishment before conviction. Each cell had held countless individuals over the decades, people whose cases had been decided in the courtrooms above, but who had spent hours or days in these confined spaces waiting for their legal proceedings to unfold. Detective Reed examined the cells carefully, noting details that revealed both the institutional nature of the space and small signs of human presence that had accumulated over years of use. The booking area had been equipped with the technology of its era, including fingerprinting equipment and photography apparatus that had been used to create the official records that documented each person's entry into the criminal justice system. The process had been more manual and time-consuming than modern booking procedures, requiring officers to complete paperwork by hand and to develop photographs, using chemical processes that took hours rather than minutes. Detective Reed found records indicating that the detention facility had been operated with attention to professional standards that emphasize safety and humane treatment of detainees. The staff had included trained correctional officers who had understood their role as maintaining security while also ensuring that people in their custody were treated with basic respect and provided with necessary medical care and other services. One incident that had been documented in detail involved a young man named Thomas Morrison, who had been arrested for burglary in 1971, but had suffered an apparent mental health crisis while in detention. Rather than simply transferring him to the county jail, the facility staff had arranged for psychiatric evaluation and had worked with the court to ensure that he received appropriate mental health treatment as part of his legal proceedings. The case had resulted in Morrison's placement in a residential treatment program rather than traditional incarceration, an outcome that had required coordination between the court, medical professionals, and social service agencies. Detective Reed found follow-up reports indicating that Morrison had successfully completed treatment and had avoided further involvement with the criminal justice system. Moving back to the upper floors, Detective Reed explored the judge's chambers, which had served as private offices where judicial decisions were researched, written, and contemplated away from the public proceedings of the courtrooms. Each chamber had reflected the personality and judicial philosophy of its occupant, with law books, personal items, and case files that had created working environments suited to the careful consideration that legal decisions required. Judge Morrison's former chamber still contained built-in bookcases that had held his extensive law library, volumes of case law and legal commentary that had informed his decisions over 3 decades on the bench. The desk where he had written countless opinions and orders faced a window overlooking the city, providing a view that had reminded him daily of the community he served and the real-world implications of his judicial decisions. Detective Reed found herself imagining Judge Morrison working late into the evening, reviewing case files and legal precedents by lamplight as he prepared for the next day's proceedings. The judicial decisions made in this chamber had affected hundreds of lives, from defendants facing criminal charges to families navigating divorce and custody disputes to businesses involved in contract disagreements. The law library on the 3rd floor had served all the judges and attorneys who had practiced in the courthouse, providing access to the legal resources necessary for researching complex legal questions and preparing persuasive arguments. The room had been designed with long tables and comfortable chairs that had accommodated the hours of reading and note-taking that legal practice required. Detective Reed could envision attorneys spending days in this library, searching through volumes of case law for precedents that might support their clients' positions or help them understand the legal principles that applied to specific situations. The research conducted in this room had formed the foundation for arguments presented in the courtrooms below, creating a connection between legal scholarship and practical advocacy that had characterized the practice of law in this building. The library had also served as an informal meeting place where attorneys from different firms had encountered each other outside the adversarial context of courtroom proceedings. These casual interactions had fostered professional relationships and mutual respect that had contributed to the collegial atmosphere that many older attorneys remembered as characteristic of legal practice in this courthouse. The building's administrative offices had housed the clerks, bailiffs, and other court personnel who had made the daily operations of the justice system possible. These offices had been the site of countless routine tasks that had kept the courts functioning smoothly. From scheduling hearings to maintaining case files to ensuring that court orders were properly documented and distributed, Detective Reed found evidence of the meticulous record-keeping that had characterized court operations during the building's active years. File cabinets still contained organizational systems that had tracked thousands of cases through various stages of legal proceedings, ensuring that important deadlines were met and that all parties received proper notification of court actions. The dedication of court personnel had been evident in the systems they had developed for managing the complex flow of information and documentation that legal proceedings required. Their work had often been invisible to the public, but had been essential to ensuring that the constitutional rights of all parties were protected and that legal proceedings were conducted fairly and efficiently. As Detective Reed completed her survey of the building, she reflected on the accumulated history of justice that these empty rooms represented. For nearly a century, this courthouse had been the setting for the community's most important legal proceedings, the place where citizens had sought resolution of their disputes and where society had imposed consequences for violations of its laws. The building had witnessed thousands of moments of human drama, from the relief of acquittals to the sorrow of guilty verdicts, from the joy of successful adoptions to the pain of contentious divorces. Each courtroom had been the setting for stories of human triumph and failure, of justice served and mercy granted, of communities wrestling with questions of right and wrong that had no easy answers. The architectural grandeur of the courthouse had been designed to inspire respect for the law and confidence in the justice system. But the real significance of the building lay in the human interactions that had filled its rooms with purpose and meaning. The judges, attorneys, court personnel, and citizens who had participated in legal proceedings here had created a living institution that had served the community's need for ordered resolution of conflicts and disputes. Now, as the building prepared for demolition, Detective Reed understood that she was witnessing the end of an era in the administration of justice. The new courthouse across town would provide more efficient facilities and modern technology, but it could not replicate the sense of history and tradition that had made this building a symbol of legal continuity and community values. The empty corridors and silent courtrooms would soon be reduced to rubble, but the decisions made here would continue to influence legal practice and community life for generations to come. The precedents established in these courtrooms had become part of the permanent legal record, while the approaches to justice pioneered by judges like Morrison and Washington had influenced legal education and judicial training programs throughout the region. As she prepared to leave the building for the final time, Detective Reed felt a profound sense of respect for the role that this courthouse had played in the community's life and growth. The building had been more than just a place where legal proceedings occurred. It had been a symbol of the community's commitment to resolving conflicts through law rather than force, to protecting individual rights while maintaining social order, and to ensuring that justice was available to all citizens, regardless of their social or economic status. The moonlight streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the marble floors, creating a scene of quiet dignity that seemed appropriate for a building that had devoted its existence to the serious business of human justice. Tomorrow, the demolition crews would begin their work. But tonight, the courthouse stood as a monument to the countless individuals who had dedicated their professional lives to the pursuit of justice and the preservation of civil society. Detective Elena Martinez drove slowly through the Riverside district at twilight, watching the evening light fade behind the modest houses that lined Oak Street and Maple Avenue. This neighborhood had been her beat for 12 years, long enough to know the rhythm of its daily life and the stories that connected its residents across generations. Tonight, she was revisiting places where crimes had occurred in years past, not investigating new incidents, but reflecting on how communities absorbed and healed from the disruptions that law enforcement documented in files and reports. The house at 247 Oak Street looked peaceful in the gathering dusk, its front porch light glowing warmly behind lace curtains that suggested the comfortable domesticity of longtime residents. But Detective Martinez remembered this address from a case file she had studied during her training, a domestic violence incident from 1978 that had required multiple police responses before reaching a resolution that protected the victim while addressing the underlying problems that had created the violent situation. The incident had involved the Morrison family, William and Susan Morrison, and their 3 children, who had lived in this house during a period when William's drinking had escalated from occasional social consumption to daily dependency that affected every aspect of family life. The police reports documented a progression of increasingly serious domestic disturbances, each one requiring more intensive intervention as the family crisis deepened. Detective Martinez parked across the street and watched the house, imagining how it had looked 45 years earlier when Officer Patricia Wong had made her first response to a neighbor's complaint about loud arguing and the sound of breaking dishes. The initial report had described a family in crisis, with Susan Morrison sporting a bruised cheek, and the children huddled in their bedroom while their father paced the living room in an alcohol-fueled rage. Officer Wong's reports had documented her patient efforts to understand the complex dynamics that had created the violent situation, recognizing that William Morrison's drinking was both a cause and a symptom of deeper problems that included unemployment, financial stress, and untreated trauma from his military service in Korea. Rather than simply arresting William and leaving the family to deal with the aftermath, Officer Wong had worked to connect them with resources that could address the root causes of their crisis. The resolution had required coordination between law enforcement, social services, and community organizations that provided support for families dealing with alcoholism and domestic violence. William Morrison had been required to attend alcohol treatment programs, while also participating in counseling sessions designed to help him develop alternative approaches to managing stress and anger. Susan Morrison had been connected with support groups for families affected by alcoholism, providing her with both practical advice about safety, planning, and emotional support from other women who understood the challenges of living with an addicted spouse. The children had received counseling through the school system, helping them process their experiences while developing healthy coping strategies for dealing with family stress. Detective Martinez had reviewed follow-up reports indicating that the Morrison family had successfully navigated their crisis, with William achieving sobriety and finding steady employment while Susan had eventually returned to school to complete her nursing degree. The house had remained their family home for many years, transforming from a site of conflict and fear into a place of recovery and stability. The current residents, an elderly couple named the Chuns, had no knowledge of the house's earlier history, but they had created their own peaceful domestic routine that reflected the neighborhood's capacity for renewal and healing. Detective Martinez watched lights come on in the kitchen windows, imagining the quiet evening activities of people whose lives had never been touched by the kind of crisis that had once filled this space with tension and fear. Moving down the street, she stopped at 186 Maple Avenue, where a burglary in 1983 had revealed the economic pressures that were affecting many families in the neighborhood during a period of high unemployment and factory closures. The case had involved 16-year-old Michael Chun, whose family had been struggling financially since his father's layoff from the textile mill that had been the area's primary employer for 3 generations. Michael had been caught stealing food from neighbors' houses, not expensive items or electronics that could be sold for cash, but basic groceries that his family needed to supplement their dwindling resources while his father searched for new employment. The investigation had revealed a family that was too proud to apply for public assistance, but too desperate to ignore their children's hunger. Detective James Rodriguez, who had handled the case, had approached it as a community problem rather than simply a criminal matter, recognizing that Michael's actions reflected larger economic pressures that were affecting many families in the neighborhood. Rather than pursuing traditional prosecution, Detective Rodriguez had worked with local churches and community organizations to develop a food assistance program that could help struggling families while preserving their dignity. Michael had been required to perform community service at the food bank that had been established to address the neighborhood's economic crisis, learning about the challenges faced by other families while also contributing to solutions that served the broader community. His parents had initially been embarrassed by their son's arrest, but they had eventually become volunteers with the food assistance program, using their experience to help other families navigate the resources available during difficult times. The house now belonged to a young family with small children, the economic crisis of the 1980s having been replaced by the gradual neighborhood improvement that had followed the development of new businesses and employment opportunities. Detective Martinez could see toys scattered across the front yard and a bicycle parked near the front steps. Signs of the ordinary family life that had returned to a place once marked by desperation and need. The neighborhood had absorbed and healed from the economic disruption that had affected so many families during that difficult period. But the community networks and support systems that had been developed in response to the crisis had become permanent features of local life. The food bank that Detective Rodriguez had helped establish still operated out of the basement of St. Mary's Church, serving families who faced temporary hardships while also providing a model for community cooperation that had influenced other neighborhood improvement efforts. Detective Martinez continued her drive through the area, stopping at the corner of Elm Street and 3rd Avenue, where a drug-related incident in 1991 had marked the beginning of the neighborhood's confrontation with the crack cocaine epidemic that was affecting urban communities throughout the country. The initial incident had involved the arrest of 3 teenagers who had been selling drugs from a vacant lot that had become a gathering place for young people who had few other recreational opportunities. The case had been handled by Detective Susan Kim, who had recognized that traditional law enforcement approaches to drug crimes often failed to address the social and economic factors that made drug dealing attractive to young people in neighborhoods with limited legitimate opportunities for advancement. Rather than simply arresting the teenagers and allowing the drug trade to continue with new participants. Detective Kim had worked to understand why young people in this neighborhood were attracted to illegal activities. Her investigation had revealed that the teenagers involved in drug dealing had been struggling with problems that included family instability, educational difficulties, and lack of positive adult mentorship that could provide guidance and support during the crucial transition from adolescence to adulthood. The vacant lot where they had been selling drugs had become their social center because no legitimate recreational facilities existed in the immediate area. Asterisk. Detective Kim had worked with community leaders, school officials, and parents to develop comprehensive responses to the drug problem that addressed both immediate law enforcement concerns and underlying social issues that created vulnerability to criminal involvement. The teenagers who had been arrested were required to participate in drug education and counseling programs, but they were also connected with job training and educational support services that provided alternative pathways to economic success. The vacant lot had been transformed into a small community garden, with residents volunteering to maintain vegetable plots that provided fresh food for local families while also creating a positive gathering place for neighborhood children and adults. The garden project had been supported by local businesses and had eventually expanded to include educational programs about nutrition and environmental stewardship that were conducted in partnership with the public schools. Detective Martinez parked near the garden, which was now mature and well established, with neat rows of vegetables and flowers that were tended by residents who had made it a symbol of community cooperation and renewal. The drug problems that had once plagued this corner had been largely eliminated through the sustained efforts of residents who had chosen to invest in positive activities, rather than simply complaining about negative ones. The teenagers who had been involved in the original drug incident had all eventually graduated from high school, with 2 of them going on to college and one becoming a community organizer who worked with at-risk youth throughout the city. Their experience with the criminal justice system had been transformed from a purely punitive encounter into an opportunity for growth and community engagement that had benefited both the individuals involved and the neighborhood as a whole. Moving through the residential streets, Detective Martinez reflected on how crime and its aftermath had become woven into the fabric of community life, creating stories that connected past and present in ways that residents might not always recognize, but that influenced the character and development of neighborhood relationships. Each incident had represented a moment of crisis or conflict, but the way these incidents had been resolved had contributed to the social capital that made community life possible. She stopped at 92 Pine Street, where a family tragedy in 1987 had brought the neighborhood together in ways that demonstrated the capacity for collective response to individual suffering. The case had involved the death of 8-year-old Maria Gonzalez, who had been struck by a car while riding her bicycle in front of her family's house. The incident had not been criminal in nature, as the driver had not been speeding or impaired, but had resulted from the lack of adequate traffic safety measures on residential streets that were increasingly used as shortcuts by commuters trying to avoid congested main thoroughfares. The investigation had been handled by Officer Robert Martinez, who had documented the dangerous traffic patterns that had contributed to the accident while also working with the family and community to address their grief and anger. The Gonzalez family had been devastated by their daughter's death, but their pain had been shared by neighbors who recognized that the traffic problems affecting Pine Street posed dangers to all the children in the area. Rather than allowing their grief to isolate them, the family had channeled their energy into advocacy for traffic safety improvements that could prevent similar tragedies from affecting other families. Officer Martinez had worked with the family and neighborhood residents to petition the city for traffic calming measures that included speed bumps, improved signage, and enhanced crosswalk markings that would make residential streets safer for pedestrians and cyclists. The campaign had required months of meetings with city officials and transportation planners, but it had eventually resulted in significant improvements that had reduced both traffic volume and vehicle speeds throughout the residential area. The memorial garden that had been planted in Maria's honor still occupied a small space near the corner where the accident had occurred, with flowers and a small plaque that reminded passersby to drive carefully and watch for children. The garden had become a symbol of the neighborhood's commitment to protecting its most vulnerable residents, while also serving as a place where Maria's family and friends could remember her life and contributions to the community. Detective Martinez had known the Gonzalez family personally, having grown up in the same neighborhood and attended school with Maria's older siblings. The tragedy had affected everyone who lived in the area, but the community response had demonstrated the kind of collective resilience that made neighborhoods into more than just collections of individual households. The traffic safety improvements that had been implemented in response to Maria's death had become models for similar projects throughout the city, with the Gonzalez family serving as advocates for transportation policies that prioritized pedestrian safety over automotive convenience. Their experience with personal tragedy had been transformed into community leadership that had benefited countless other families and children. As evening deepened into night, Detective Martinez continued her tour of places where crime and tragedy had intersected with ordinary neighborhood life, creating moments of crisis that had tested the community's capacity for compassion, cooperation, and collective problem-solving. Each location held memories of individuals and families who had faced difficult circumstances, but they also represented the ongoing human effort to create safe and supportive environments where people could live together peacefully despite their differences and challenges. The houses and streets looked quiet and peaceful in the darkness, with porch lights glowing and television screens flickering behind curtained windows. But Detective Martinez understood that this apparent tranquility was the result of countless small acts of neighborly concern and community engagement that had transformed potential conflicts into opportunities for cooperation and mutual support. She thought about the files and reports that documented these incidents in the official records of the police department, how the formal language of law enforcement captured only part of the story of how communities actually responded to crime and crisis. The real resolution of these cases had occurred not in courtrooms or police stations, but in living rooms and community centers, school auditoriums and church basements, where residents had gathered to discuss their shared concerns and develop collective responses to the challenges they faced. The neighborhood that surrounded her had been shaped by these experiences, with current residents benefiting from the traffic safety improvements, community gardens, and support networks that had been developed in response to earlier crises. The crimes and tragedies that had once disrupted the peace of these streets had been absorbed into the community's collective memory and had contributed to its capacity for addressing future challenges through cooperation rather than conflict. Detective Martinez finally parked in front of her own house at the end of her patrol, feeling a renewed appreciation for the complex web of relationships and shared experiences that made neighborhood life possible. The crimes she investigated in her professional capacity were part of a larger story about how communities maintained their stability and character despite the constant pressures and challenges that threatened to disrupt the delicate balance of trust and cooperation that civil society required. The files in the police archives documented the official response to these incidents, but the real story was written in the ongoing life of the community itself, in the relationships between neighbors who had learned to support each other during difficult times and in the institutions, and traditions that had been developed to prevent future problems while responding compassionately to human needs and struggles. as she prepared to end her shift and return to her own family life. Detective Martinez understood that her work as a police officer was part of a larger community effort to maintain the social fabric that made peaceful coexistence possible in a world where individual interests and needs sometimes came into conflict with collective well-being and security. The night shift at Central Precinct began at 11 p.m. with the soft electronic chime that marked the changing of the guard. As day shift officers completed their final reports and evening shift personnel settled into the quieter rhythm that characterized police work during the hours when most of the city slept. Sergeant David Kim had been working these overnight hours for 18 years, long enough to understand that night duty required different skills and temperament than the more visible police work that occurred during daylight hours. The main desk area took on a different character after midnight, with the fluorescent lights dimmed to a more comfortable level and the constant radio chatter reduced to the essential communications that connected patrol units with dispatch and with each other. The desk sergeant's position commanded a view of the entire operations floor, where officers worked at computer terminals and typewriters, transforming the events of their patrol shifts into the formal documentation that would become part of the permanent record of police activity. Asterisk. Officer Linda Rodriguez sat at workstation 7, typing a report about a domestic disturbance call that had required more patience than authority to resolve. The call had come in at 10:47 p.m. from an apartment complex on the east side, where neighbors had reported loud arguing and the sound of furniture being moved or thrown. When Officer Rodriguez and her partner had arrived at the scene, they had found a situation that was more complex than the initial report had suggested. The apartment belonged to Mrs. Helen Wong, a 78-year-old widow who had been arguing with her adult son, Michael, about his decision to move back into her spare bedroom following his recent divorce. The loud noises that had prompted the neighbor's call had been the sound of Michael moving boxes and furniture as he attempted to establish his temporary living space in a way that would minimize disruption to his mother's established routines. Officer Rodriguez's report documented the patient conversation that had been required to help both mother and son understand each other's concerns and develop an arrangement that would allow them to share the apartment peacefully until Michael could find his own place. Mrs. Wong had been worried about losing her privacy and independence, while Michael had been struggling with the emotional and financial pressures of rebuilding his life. After his marriage had ended, the resolution had involved establishing ground rules for shared living that addressed both parties' needs for personal space and mutual respect, with Officer Rodriguez serving as a neutral mediator who could help them communicate their concerns without the emotional escalation that had characterized their earlier attempts to resolve the situation independently. The final agreement had included provisions for shared household responsibilities, quiet hours that would prevent future noise complaints, and a timeline for Michael to find his own housing that would give both family members a clear expectation for the duration of the arrangement. Officer Rodriguez typed carefully, choosing words that captured the human complexity of the situation, while also documenting the specific steps that had been taken to resolve the immediate problem and prevent future incidents. The report would become part of the official record, but it would also serve as a reference for other officers who might encounter similar family conflicts that required mediation rather than enforcement. At the desk beside her, Officer James Chun was completing paperwork related to a vandalism case that had required several hours of investigation to determine that no crime had actually been committed. A report had come in about graffiti on the site of a downtown office building, but Officer Chun's investigation had revealed that the artwork had been commissioned by the Ikov Bunba building's owner as part of a community art project designed to discourage unauthorized graffiti by providing legitimate opportunities for local artists to display their work. The misunderstanding had occurred because the building's night security guard, who had not been informed about the art project, had reported the mural as vandalism when he had discovered it during his evening rounds. Officer Chun had spent time talking with the building owner, the security guard, and the artist who had created the mural, ensuring that everyone understood the situation and that proper procedures were established to prevent similar confusion in the future. Officer Chun's report documented not just the facts of the incident, but also the communication breakdown that had led to the unnecessary police response, along with recommendations for improving coordination between building management and security personnel. The report would serve as a record of how the situation had been resolved, while also providing insights that might help prevent similar misunderstandings. In other locations, the night shift provided time for this kind of thorough documentation, allowing officers to reflect on their calls and document not just what had happened, but also what they had learned from each incident. The pace of overnight police work was generally slower than day or evening shifts, creating opportunities for the careful analysis and reporting that formed the foundation of effective law enforcement. Sergeant Kim moved through the workstation area, checking on the progress of various reports and offering assistance with cases that required supervisory review or approval. His 23 years of experience had taught him that the quality of police reports often determined the success of subsequent investigations and prosecutions, making the overnight documentation process a crucial component of the department's overall effectiveness. At Workstation 12, Officer Patricia Martinez was documenting a missing person case that had been resolved through patient investigation and community cooperation. The case had involved an elderly man with early-stage dementia who had become confused during an evening walk and had been unable to find his way home. The initial report had come from his daughter, who had discovered his absence when she had called to check on him during her usual evening phone call. Officer Martinez had responded by conducting a systematic search of the neighborhood surrounding the missing man's house, knocking on doors and asking residents whether they had seen him during the evening hours. The search had eventually led to a local diner, where the man had been sitting quietly in a corner booth, unable to remember his address or phone number, but safe and unharmed. The resolution had required coordination with the man's family and his physician to ensure that appropriate safety measures were put in place to prevent future incidents while also preserving his independence and dignity. Officer Martinez had connected the family with community resources that provided support for people dealing with dementia and their caregivers, recognizing that the missing person incident was likely to be repeated unless underlying issues were addressed. Her report documented not just the successful resolution of the immediate crisis, but also the preventive measures that had been arranged to reduce the likelihood of future emergencies. The documentation would serve as a reference for other officers who might encounter similar cases involving elderly residents with cognitive impairments who lived independently in the community. The radio traffic during the night shift consisted primarily of routine patrol checks and occasional calls for service that required immediate response, but the overall volume of activity was significantly lower than during daytime hours when traffic accidents, business disputes, and other urban conflicts generated constant demands for police attention. This quieter pace allowed officers to focus more carefully on documentation and to engage in the kind of thorough investigation that had characterized Officer Martinez's handling of the missing person case. Officer Robert Foster worked at a terminal near the windows that overlooked the parking area, typing a report about a break-in at a local convenience store that had been solved through community cooperation and careful attention to detail. The incident had occurred during the early evening hours, when the store clerk had stepped into the back room to receive a delivery, leaving the front counter unattended for approximately 10 minutes. When the clerk had returned, he had discovered that someone had taken approximately $40 from the cash register, along with several packages of cigarettes and energy drinks. The theft had been reported immediately, and Officer Foster had responded to begin an investigation that had initially seemed unlikely to result in an arrest, given the lack of witnesses and the small amount of merchandise involved. However, Officer Foster's systematic approach to the investigation had included reviewing security camera footage from neighboring businesses and interviewing residents of nearby apartments who might have observed suspicious activity during the relevant time period. This patient detective work had eventually led to the identification of a local teenager who had been struggling with financial problems and had made an impulsive decision to take advantage of the temporarily unattended store. The case had been resolved through a combination of formal police procedures and community-based problem solving, with the teenager required to make restitution for the stolen items while also participating in counseling and job training programs that addressed the underlying issues that had contributed to his criminal behavior. Officer Foster's report documented both the investigative techniques that had led to the successful resolution and the community resources that had been mobilized to prevent future incidents. The night shift officers worked in an atmosphere of concentrated focus, with minimal interruption from phone calls or walk-in visitors that characterized daytime police operations. This quiet environment was conducive to the careful thought and attention to detail that effective report writing required, allowing officers to document their cases thoroughly while also reflecting on the lessons learned from each incident. Sergeant Kim maintained a pot of coffee in the break area that provided fuel for the long hours of detailed paperwork that filled much of the overnight shift. The coffee served not just as caffeine but as a focal point for informal conversations between officers who shared insights about their cases and discussed strategies for handling similar situations in the future. Officer Angela Thompson sat in the break area, reviewing her notes from a domestic violence call that had required careful documentation due to the complex legal and safety issues involved. The incident had occurred at a residence where a history of domestic disputes had resulted in multiple police responses over the past several months, creating a pattern that required ongoing monitoring and intervention. The current incident had involved a verbal argument that had not escalated to physical violence, but Officer Thompson's knowledge of the household's history had prompted her to conduct a thorough assessment of the safety risks and to ensure that appropriate resources were available to all family members involved. Her report would need to document not just the immediate incident, but also the ongoing concerns that made this household a priority for continued police attention. The documentation process for domestic violence cases required particular attention to detail, as the reports might be used in future legal proceedings and needed to provide clear evidence of patterns of behavior that could inform decisions about restraining orders, custody arrangements, and other legal protections. Officer Thompson's experience had taught her that the quality of her initial documentation often determined the effectiveness of subsequent interventions designed to protect vulnerable family members. As the night progressed toward dawn, the pace of report writing gradually increased as officers completed the documentation for calls that had occurred during the latter part of their shift. The approaching end of the overnight period brought a subtle sense of urgency to finish all paperwork before the day shift arrived and the precinct returned to its busier daytime rhythm. Officer Michael Davis worked to complete a report about a noise complaint that had revealed interesting insights about community, relationships, and neighbor interactions. The initial call had come from a resident who complained about loud music coming from a nearby apartment, but Officer Davis's investigation had uncovered a more complex situation, involving cultural differences and generational conflicts that required sensitive mediation rather than simple enforcement of noise ordinances. The apartment in question was occupied by a young family that had recently immigrated from El Salvador, and their evening gatherings with friends and extended family represented important cultural traditions that helped them maintain connections to their heritage while adapting to life in a new country. The complaining neighbor was an elderly man who worked early morning shifts and needed to sleep during the evening hours, when the family's social activities typically occurred. Officer Davis had worked with both parties to develop an arrangement that respected the family's cultural practices while also addressing the neighbor's legitimate need for quiet during his sleeping hours. The resolution had involved scheduling social gatherings for earlier in the evening and using the apartment's back rooms for activities that might generate noise that could disturb neighbors. His report documented not just the immediate resolution, but also the cultural sensitivity that had been required to address a situation where different community groups had different expectations about appropriate behavior and noise levels. The case illustrated the importance of understanding community dynamics and cultural differences in developing effective responses to neighbor disputes. The final hour of the night shift brought a sense of completion as officers finished their reports and prepared to brief their day shift counterparts about ongoing cases and situations that would require continued attention. The careful documentation that had occupied much of the overnight hours would become part of the permanent record that allowed the police department to maintain continuity of service across different shifts and time periods. Sergeant Kim conducted a final review of all reports completed during the shift, ensuring that they met departmental standards for completeness and accuracy, while also checking for any cases that might require immediate follow-up or supervisory attention. His experience had taught him that the quality of overnight documentation often determined the key effectiveness of subsequent investigative and enforcement activities. As the first light of dawn began to appear in the windows, the night shift prepared to end with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized the previous 8 hours. The reports they had completed would join thousands of others in the department's filing systems, creating a comprehensive record of police activity that documented not just criminal incidents but also the ongoing effort to maintain community safety and order through patient problem solving and careful attention to human needs and concerns. The morning shift would soon arrive to begin another cycle of police work, but the foundation for their efforts had been laid during the quiet hours of the night shift, when time moved more slowly and officers had the opportunity to document their cases with the thoroughness and reflection that effective law enforcement required. The reports they had written would outlast their shift, becoming part of the institutional memory that guided police work and community relations for years to come. The evidence storage facility occupied the entire third floor of the old courthouse annex, a vast space filled with metal shelving units that held thousands of boxes, each one containing the physical remnants of investigations that had been completed years or decades earlier. Detective Sarah Reeves moved slowly between the rows, her footsteps echoing softly in the high-ceilinged room where afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted gradually as the hours passed. Each box was labeled with case numbers and dates that told the story of the department's investigative history, from the handwritten tags of the 1950s to the computer-printed labels that had been introduced in the 1990s. The progression of evidence storage methods reflected changes in technology and procedure, but the fundamental purpose remained the same: preserving the physical traces of human behavior that had intersected with the criminal justice system. Detective Reeves was conducting an audit of cold cases from the 1970s, reviewing evidence that had been preserved for decades in the hope that advances in forensic Science might eventually provide new insights into unsolved investigations. The work required patience and attention to detail, as each box contained not just physical evidence, but also photographs, diagrams, and documentation that captured the investigative efforts of officers who had worked these cases when the trail was still fresh. The first box she opened contained materials from a burglary case that had occurred in 1973 at the Riverside Elementary School. The photograph showed classrooms that had been ransacked by someone searching for something specific, with desks overturned and filing cabinets emptied, but expensive audio-visual equipment left undisturbed. The investigating detective, Lieutenant Robert Martinez, had recognized that the pattern of destruction suggested someone familiar with the school's layout and operations. The evidence box contained the items that had been recovered during the investigation, including a distinctive screwdriver that had been left behind by the intruder and a torn piece of fabric that had been caught on a window latch. The photographs documented the scene with careful attention to detail, showing not just the obvious signs of forced entry, but also subtle clues that had guided the investigation toward its eventual resolution. Lieutenant Martinez's case notes, preserved alongside the physical evidence, revealed the methodical approach that had characterized his investigation. He had interviewed every current and former employee of the school, looking for someone who might have had both access to the building and knowledge of where valuable items were stored. The investigation had eventually focused on a former custodian who had been terminated several months earlier following allegations of alcohol used during work hours. The case had been solved when the suspect had attempted to return the stolen items, which had turned out to be historical documents and photographs related to the school's founding that had sentimental rather than monetary value. The former custodian, Thomas Wilson, had taken the materials during a moment of anger and resentment following his termination, but had realized that destroying pieces of community history would hurt people who had nothing to do with his employment problems. Detective Reeves examined the recovered photographs, black and white images from the 1920s that showed the school's original construction and early classes. The pictures had been carefully preserved in acid-free sleeves, their historical value recognized by both the police department and the school district. The case had been resolved with Wilson performing community service that included helping to organize and catalog the school's historical archives, transforming his moment of destructive impulse into a contribution to community memory. Moving to the next box, Detective Reeves found evidence from a vandalism case that had puzzled investigators in 1974. Someone had been creating elaborate chalk drawings on sidewalks throughout the downtown area, artwork that was sophisticated enough to attract positive attention from passers-by but technically violated city ordinances against unauthorized marking of public property. The photographs documented dozens of these sidewalk murals, each one displaying a level of artistic skill that suggested formal training and significant time investment. The drawings depicted scenes from local history, portraits of community members, and abstract designs that incorporated architectural features of the buildings where they appeared. Detective Susan Kim, who had investigated the case, had approached it more as an art mystery than a typical vandalism incident. The evidence box contained samples of the chalk that had been used, along with photographs taken at different times of day to show how the artwork interacted with changing light conditions. Detective Kim had documented not just the locations where the drawings appeared, but also the community response, which had been overwhelmingly positive despite the technical illegality of the activity. The investigation had revealed that the artist was Maria Santos, a recent art school graduate who had been struggling to find venues for displaying her work and had chosen public sidewalks as an alternative gallery space. Rather than pursuing criminal charges, Detective Kim had worked with city officials and local business owners to create legitimate opportunities for Santos to continue creating public art through official community art programs. The case had resulted in the establishment of the city's first public art initiative, with Santos becoming the coordinator of a program that provided legal walls and spaces for local artists to display their work. The photographs in the evidence box showed the evolution of her sidewalk art from unauthorized expressions to community-supported murals that became permanent fixtures of the downtown cultural landscape. Detective Reeves found the progression particularly moving, seeing how what had initially been documented as criminal evidence had been transformed into the foundation for ongoing community cultural development. The chalk samples and photographs that had once been collected to support prosecution had become historical artifacts documenting the beginning of the city's public art movement. Another box contained materials from a case that had initially appeared to be a series of threatening letters sent to local business owners in 1975. The letters, written in block printing on plain paper, had warned recipients about unspecified consequences if they continued certain unspecified activities. The vague nature of the threats had made investigation difficult, as it was unclear what specific behavior the letter writer wanted to discourage, or what kind of retaliation they might be planning. Detective William Chun had collected the letters and conducted handwriting analysis while also interviewing each recipient to look for common factors that might explain why they had been targeted. The investigation had revealed that all of the recipients were business owners who had recently joined the VA Chamber of Commerce and had supported a downtown redevelopment project that involved demolishing several older buildings. The case had taken an unexpected turn when Detective Chun had realized that the letters were not actually threats, but attempts at community organizing by someone who lacked the communication skills or social connections to express their concerns through normal channels. The letter writer had turned out to be Albert Morrison, an elderly man whose barbershop was scheduled for demolition as part of the redevelopment project. Morrison had been trying to warn other business owners about the long-term consequences of the redevelopment plans, which he believed would destroy the character of the downtown area and drive out small businesses that couldn't afford the higher rents that new construction would bring. His letters had been clumsy attempts to build opposition to the project, but his lack of formal education and social anxiety had made his communications appear threatening rather than persuasive. Detective Chun had worked with Morrison and the business owners to facilitate productive conversations about the redevelopment project, helping to transform what had appeared to be a criminal matter into a community planning discussion. The evidence box contained not just the original letters, but also documentation of the community meetings that had resulted from the investigation, showing how police work had evolved into civic engagement. The redevelopment project had ultimately proceeded, but with modifications that preserved some historic buildings and provided relocation assistance for displaced businesses. Morrison's barbershop had been moved to a new location within the downtown area, and he had become an active participant in planning processes that affected local businesses. Moving deeper into the storage area, Detective Reeves found boxes containing evidence from cases that had required collaboration between law enforcement and other community institutions. One box held materials from a 1976 investigation into reports of suspicious activity at the public library, where patrons had complained about a man who spent long hours reading in the periodical section and taking extensive notes. The investigating officer, Detective Patricia Wong, had initially approached the case as a potential security threat, given the concerns that had been raised about the man's behavior and the fact that he seemed to be conducting research about local government operations and business activities. However, her investigation had revealed a more complex situation that required understanding rather than enforcement. The man was Dr. James Rodriguez, a retired sociology professor who was conducting research for a book about small-town economic development. His extensive note-taking and interest in local government records had been motivated by academic curiosity rather than any kind of malicious intent. The complaints about his behavior had resulted from misunderstandings about his research methods and the amount of time he spent in the library. Detective Wong had worked with library staff and Dr. Rodriguez to address the concerns that had been raised, while also ensuring that his legitimate research activities could continue without creating discomfort for other patrons. The resolution had involved establishing protocols for researchers who needed extended access to library materials while also educating library staff about distinguishing between suspicious behavior and intensive academic work. The evidence box contained copies of Dr. Rodriguez's research notes, which had been reviewed during the investigation to confirm their scholarly nature. His book had eventually been published by a university press and had included acknowledgments thanking the police department and library staff for their assistance with his research. The case had become an example of how law enforcement could support rather than hinder legitimate academic inquiry when investigations were conducted with appropriate sensitivity and understanding. The photographs in these evidence boxes captured moments that had been frozen in time, preserving not just the immediate facts of individual cases, but also the social context and community relationships that had shaped their investigation and resolution. Detective Reeves found herself moved by the care that had been taken to document these incidents, recognizing that each photograph and piece of evidence represented someone's attempt to understand and respond to human behavior that had disrupted normal community routines. One particularly intriguing box contained materials from a 1977 case involving mysterious packages that had been left at various locations throughout the city. The packages, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, had contained no threatening materials but had created anxiety among recipients who had no idea why they had been selected or what the packages might represent. Detective Frank Thompson had investigated the incident systematically, documenting each package and its contents while also trying to identify patterns that might reveal the sender's identity and motivation. The packages had contained small gifts, books, artwork, baked goods, and handwritten notes expressing appreciation for various contributions to community life. The investigation had eventually led to Mrs. Dorothy Kim, an elderly widow who had been quietly expressing gratitude to people who had helped her during difficult periods following her husband's death. She had been too shy to thank people directly, but had wanted to acknowledge the kindness that neighbors, shopkeepers, and service providers had shown during her time of grief and adjustment. Mrs. Kim's secret gift-giving had been motivated by genuine appreciation, but she had not realized that anonymous packages might be perceived as threatening in an era when community members were becoming more security conscious. Detective Thompson had worked with her to find more direct ways of expressing gratitude, while also helping recipients understand the innocent motivation behind the mysterious packages. The case had resulted in Mrs. Kim becoming more actively involved in community organizations, where her desire to help others could be channeled into volunteer activities that provided both social connection and opportunities for service. The evidence box contained some of the handwritten notes that had accompanied her gifts, expressions of heartfelt gratitude that revealed the depth of appreciation that quiet acts of kindness had generated in someone who had been struggling with loneliness and loss. As afternoon light gradually faded in the storage facility, Detective Reeves continued her methodical review of evidence boxes, each one containing fragments of stories that had once commanded significant investigative attention, but had now settled into the quiet permanence of archived history. The photographs and physical evidence represented moments when ordinary community life had been disrupted by incidents that required police response, but they also documented the creativity and patience that officers had brought to understanding and resolving these disruptions. The work of reviewing cold case evidence required a different kind of attention than active investigations, allowing for reflection on the broader patterns and themes that connected individual incidents into larger, stories about community life and law enforcement practice. Detective Reeves found herself impressed by the thoroughness and humanity that had characterized investigations from earlier decades, when officers had apparently had more time and latitude for the kind of comprehensive problem-solving that addressed underlying causes rather than just immediate symptoms. The evidence storage facility itself represented the police department's institutional memory, preserving not just the physical traces of criminal activity, but also documentation of investigative methods and community relationships that had evolved over decades of law enforcement practice. Each box contained lessons about human behavior and police work that remained relevant despite changes in technology and procedure. As evening approached, Detective Reeves prepared to conclude her audit, feeling grateful for the opportunity to connect with the accumulated wisdom of officers who had dedicated their careers to understanding and responding to the complex challenges of maintaining order and safety in a diverse community. The evidence they had collected and preserved would continue to serve as both historical record and practical guidance for future generations of law enforcement professionals who would face similar challenges in their own work. Detective Marcus Williams walked slowly through the downtown district as evening shadows lengthened across the familiar streets, seeing the urban landscape with the particular perspective that came from 25 years of investigating crimes that had occurred in these same locations. Each building, each corner, each small park held layers of history that connected past incidents to present tranquility, creating an invisible map of human stories that had been resolved and absorbed into the ongoing life of the community. The corner of 5th and Main Streets looked ordinary in the fading daylight, with evening commuters waiting for buses and pedestrians moving between shops and restaurants that served the daily needs of neighborhood residents. But Detective Williams remembered this intersection from a case file he had studied during his training, a complex investigation from 1965 that had involved a series of pickpocket incidents during the busy lunch hours when downtown workers crowded the sidewalks. The case had been handled by Detective Lieutenant Angela Martinez, whose methodical approach to pattern analysis had eventually revealed that the thefts were being committed by a team of teenagers who had developed sophisticated techniques for working together to distract victims while removing wallets and purses without detection. The investigation had required weeks of surveillance and careful observation to understand the methods being used and identify the individuals responsible. What had made the case particularly interesting was Detective Martinez's recognition that the teenagers involved had demonstrated remarkable organizational skills and attention to detail that could be redirected toward legitimate activities if appropriate opportunities were provided. Rather than simply arresting them and allowing the criminal justice system to run its usual course, she had worked with community organizations to develop alternative programs that could engage their talents in positive ways. The resolution had involved the teenagers participating in a job training program that had been specifically designed to utilize their street smarts and ability to work as a team. Several of them had eventually found employment in retail security, using their understanding of theft techniques to help prevent crime rather than commit it. Others had been connected with educational opportunities that had allowed them to develop their organizational abilities through legitimate channels. Detective Williams paused at the bus stop where many of the original thefts had occurred, watching the normal flow of people going about their daily routines without any awareness of the incidents that had once disrupted the peace and safety of this location. The teenagers who had caused problems here 58 years earlier had long since become productive adults. Their brief encounter with the criminal justice system transformed into an opportunity for growth and community contribution. Moving down Main Street, Detective Williams passed the building that had once housed Morrison's department store, where a shoplifting case in 1968 had revealed the economic pressures affecting many families during a period of factory closures and unemployment. The store had since been converted into offices and apartments, but Detective Williams could still visualize the layout that had been documented in police reports from that era. The shoplifting had involved Mrs. Helen Chun, a mother of 3 who had been taking small items of children's clothing and school supplies that her family needed, but could no longer afford following her husband's layoff from the textile mill. The case had been investigated by Officer Robert Kim, who had recognized that prosecuting Mrs. Chun would worsen her family's problems without addressing the underlying economic crisis that had motivated her actions. Officer Kim had worked with the store manager and local social service agencies to develop a response that provided immediate assistance to the Chun family while also addressing the broader pattern of economic distress that was affecting many households in the community. Mrs. Chun had been connected with emergency assistance programs and job training opportunities, while the store had participated in a community support network that helped struggling families access basic necessities without resorting to theft. The case had contributed to the development of the city's first comprehensive anti-poverty program, with Mrs. Chen eventually becoming a community organizer who helped other families navigate the social services system and find resources during times of economic hardship. The building that had once been the site of her desperate attempt to provide for her children had been transformed into offices that housed some of the social service programs that had grown out of the community's response to the economic challenges of that era. Detective Williams continued his walk through the business district, noting how the physical landscape had evolved while the underlying patterns of human need and community response remained constant. The crimes that had occurred in these locations decades earlier had been symptoms of larger social problems, but their resolution had contributed to the development of systems and relationships that continued to serve the community's needs. The small park on Elm Street had been the site of a vandalism case in 1971 that had initially appeared to be simple property destruction, but had revealed deeper issues related to youth recreation and community engagement. Someone had been spray painting messages on park benches and playground equipment, creating what appeared to be random graffiti that had prompted complaints from parents and neighborhood residents. Detective Susan Rodriguez had investigated the case by spending time in the park during different hours of the day, observing how the space was used by various community groups and trying to understand what might be motivating the vandalism. Her investigation had revealed that the graffiti was actually part of an ongoing conversation between teenagers who had been using the park as an unofficial gathering place, but had felt excluded from formal recreation programs that didn't meet their interests or needs. The messages on the benches and equipment had been attempts at communication between young people who lacked other venues for expressing their thoughts about community issues that affected their daily lives. Detective Rodriguez had worked with parks and recreation staff to develop programming that engaged teenagers as partners in park maintenance and improvement rather than treating them as potential troublemakers who needed to be excluded or controlled. The resolution had resulted in the creation of a youth advisory committee that gave teenagers formal input into park programming and maintenance decisions. The vandalism had stopped when the young people responsible had been given legitimate channels for communication and community participation. The park had been renovated with input from youth committee members, creating spaces that served the needs of multiple age groups while fostering positive relationships between different community constituencies. Detective Williams sat on one of the benches that had once been covered with graffiti, now part of a well-maintained park that served families throughout the neighborhood. The teenagers who had been spray painting messages here in the 1970s had grown into adults who were now bringing their own children to this same park, their youthful desire for community engagement having been channeled into ongoing civic participation that strengthened neighborhood life. The residential area beyond the park held its own collection of memories related to crimes that had been resolved through community cooperation and creative problem solving. Detective Williams walked slowly down Oak Street, where a series of bicycle thefts in 1973 had been solved through a neighborhood watch program that had brought residents together in new ways that had strengthened social connections beyond the immediate goal of crime prevention. The thefts had been occurring throughout the summer, with children's bicycles disappearing from front yards, driveways, and even locked garages. The investigation had been handled by Officer Patricia Wong, who had recognized that the pattern of thefts suggested someone familiar with the neighborhood who knew when families were away from home and where bicycles were typically stored. Officer Wong had worked with residents to organize regular evening meetings where neighbors could share information about suspicious activities, while also getting to know each other better and developing the kind of informal surveillance network that had made crime more difficult and detection more likely. The meetings had evolved into ongoing social gatherings that had strengthened community relationships beyond their original crime prevention purpose. The bicycle thefts had been solved when the Neighborhood Watch Network had identified a local teenager who had been taking the bicycles not to sell them, but to create a collection that he kept hidden in an abandoned garage. The teenager, Michael Morrison, had been fascinated by different types and styles of bicycles, but had lacked the money to purchase them legitimately or the social skills to ask neighbors if he could examine their bikes more closely. The resolution had involved Michael returning all of the stolen bicycles while also being connected with a local bike shop where he could volunteer in exchange for learning about bicycle mechanics and repair. His interest in bicycles had eventually led to a career in bike shop management, while the Neighborhood Watch program that had been created to catch him had evolved into an ongoing community organization that addressed various local issues and maintained social connections between residents. Detective Williams passed the house where Michael Morrison had grown up, now occupied by a different family whose children played in the same yard where stolen bicycles had once been stored. The crime that had once disrupted the peace of this neighborhood had ultimately strengthened community bonds and had contributed to the kind of social capital that made future crime less likely while enhancing the quality of life for all residents. The old courthouse building, which had been converted into a community center after the new judicial complex had been built, stood at the heart of the downtown area like a monument to the evolution of justice and community response to crime. Detective Williams had attended community meetings in this building, where former courtrooms had been transformed into spaces for public forums, cultural events, and social service programs that addressed many of the underlying issues that had once generated criminal cases. The building's transformation reflected broader changes in the community's approach to crime prevention and resolution, with emphasis shifting from purely punitive responses to comprehensive strategies that addressed social problems before they resulted in criminal behavior. The courtrooms where people had once been sentenced for various offenses now hosted programs designed to prevent crime through education, job training, and community engagement. Detective Williams entered the building and walked through corridors that had once echoed with the formal language of legal proceedings, but now carried the sounds of children in after-school programs, adults in job training classes, and seniors in social activities that provided community connection and mutual support. The physical structure had remained largely unchanged, but its purpose had evolved to reflect new understanding about the relationship between community health and public safety. The main courtroom had been converted into a performance space, where local theater groups and musicians presented programs that brought diverse community members together for shared cultural experiences. Detective Williams had attended many of these events, appreciating how the space that had once been devoted to determining guilt and innocence had been transformed into a venue for celebrating human creativity and community collaboration. The former jury deliberation rooms had been converted into meeting spaces for community organizations that addressed issues ranging from housing and employment to education and healthcare. The same careful attention to fairness and thorough consideration that had once characterized jury deliberations now guided community planning. processes that aim to prevent problems before they required law enforcement intervention. As evening deepened into night, Detective Williams concluded his walk through the downtown area, feeling a profound sense of connection to the layers of history that had shaped this urban landscape. The crimes that had once occurred in these locations had been absorbed into the community's collective memory and had contributed to the development of systems and relationships that continued to serve residents' needs while preventing many problems that might otherwise have required police intervention. The streets and buildings that surrounded him had witnessed countless human dramas, moments of crisis and conflict that had tested the community's capacity for compassion and problem-solving. But they had also been the setting for resolutions that had demonstrated the possibility of transforming challenges into opportunities for growth and community strengthening. The physical environment of the city had changed significantly over the decades, with old buildings demolished and new construction altering the appearance of familiar neighborhoods. But the fundamental patterns of human behavior and community response had remained remarkably consistent, with each generation facing similar challenges and developing solutions that built upon the accumulated wisdom of previous efforts. Detective Williams understood that his own work as a police officer was part of this larger story of community development and social problem-solving. The cases he investigated and the reports he wrote would eventually become part of the archived history that future officers would study, just as he had learned from the documented experiences of colleagues who had worked these same streets in earlier decades. The city around him would continue to evolve, with new crimes and new challenges requiring creative responses that honored both public safety and human dignity. But the foundation had been laid by previous generations of police officers, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who had chosen cooperation over conflict and understanding over punishment whenever possible. As he returned to his patrol car and prepared to resume his official duties, Detective Williams carried with him a renewed appreciation for the continuity of community life and the accumulated wisdom that connected past efforts to present opportunities. The city had indeed become an archive, preserving in its physical structure and social relationships the lessons learned through decades of patient work to maintain order and safety while fostering the kind of community environment where all residents could thrive. The record's completion center occupied the top floor of the Central Police Building, a space dedicated to the final processing of cases that had reached their conclusion through resolution, conviction, acquittal, or the passage of time that transformed active investigations into historical documentation. Detective Chief Larva Morrison presided over this department, with the solemnity appropriate to work that involved closing the official chapters of human stories that had intersected with the criminal justice system. The late afternoon light streamed through tall windows that overlooked the city, casting long shadows across rows of filing cabinets and computer workstations where clerks and detectives completed the detailed paperwork that would determine how each case was officially remembered and preserved. This was the place where investigations ended, where the careful documentation that had begun with initial police reports was compiled into comprehensive files that would be stored permanently in the archives that future generations might consult to understand how law enforcement had functioned during this particular era. Detective Morrison moved quietly between the workstations, reviewing cases that were approaching their final disposition and ensuring that each file contained the complete documentation necessary for proper archival storage. The work required attention to detail that went beyond simple bureaucratic requirements, as these final files would serve as the primary record of how specific crimes had been investigated and resolved, becoming part of the institutional memory that would guide future police work and community relations. At Workstation 7, Detective Robert Chun was completing the final paperwork for a case that had been resolved through community mediation rather than traditional prosecution. The incident had involved a neighborhood dispute that had escalated to the point where police intervention had been necessary. But the resolution had been achieved through patient facilitation of communication between parties, who had discovered that their conflict was based on misunderstandings rather than fundamental disagreements about rights and responsibilities. The case file contained not just the initial police reports, but also documentation of the mediation process, letters from community members who had participated in the resolution, and follow-up reports indicating that the relationships between neighbors had been strengthened rather than permanently damaged by their temporary conflict. Detective Chun was preparing this comprehensive documentation for archival storage, ensuring that future officers and community leaders would be able to understand how alternative dispute resolution methods could be successfully integrated with traditional law enforcement approaches. The final case summary that Detective Chun was writing would become part of the permanent record, describing not just what had happened, but how the police department had chosen to respond, and what lessons had been learned from the experience. This kind of documentation served multiple purposes, providing accountability for police actions, while also preserving knowledge that could inform future training and policy development. At the adjacent workstation, Officer Patricia Wong was completing files for several cases that had been resolved through what the department classified as restorative justice approaches, where offenders had been required to make direct amends to victims and communities rather than simply serving time in jail or paying fines to the court system. These cases required particularly detailed documentation as they represented departures from standard procedures that needed to be carefully justified and explained for future reference. One case involved a teenager who had been caught vandalizing public property but had been required to spend several months working with the parks department to repair and improve the facilities he had damaged. The resolution had required coordination between law enforcement, juvenile court services, the parks department, and the teenager's family to create a meaningful consequence that addressed the harm caused while also providing an opportunity for the young person to develop a more positive relationship with his community. Officer Wong's final report documented not just the successful completion of the teenager's community service, but also the ongoing positive changes in his behavior and attitude that had resulted from the experience. The teenager had continued volunteering with the Parks Department even after his required service had been completed, and had eventually been hired as a seasonal employee who worked with youth groups to maintain public recreational facilities. The case file contained letters from park supervisors, teachers, and community members who had observed the teenager's transformation from someone who damaged public property to someone who took pride in maintaining and improving community resources. This documentation would serve as evidence of the effectiveness of restorative justice approaches while also providing a model for similar cases that might arise in the future. The quiet atmosphere of the records completion center encouraged the kind of reflective work that these final case summaries required, allowing officers to consider not just the immediate outcomes of their investigations, but also the broader implications for community relations and police practice. The final documentation process served as an opportunity for learning and institutional memory development that extended beyond the specific facts of individual cases. Detective Sandra Kim worked at a terminal near the windows, completing files for a series of cases that had been resolved through collaboration between law enforcement and social service agencies. These cases had involved individuals whose criminal behavior had been connected to mental health challenges, substance abuse problems, or housing instability that required comprehensive intervention rather than simple prosecution and punishment. The documentation for these cases was particularly complex, as it needed to account for the multiple agencies and services that had been involved in developing and implementing treatment and support plans for individuals who had committed crimes, but had also been struggling with underlying problems that required ongoing assistance. Detective Kim was ensuring that the final files contained complete information about the services provided, the outcomes achieved, and the lessons learned about effective coordination between different systems. One case had involved a homeless individual who had been repeatedly arrested for minor offenses like trespassing and public intoxication, creating a cycle of jail time and release that had not addressed the underlying issues that were driving his criminal behavior. The resolution had required developing a comprehensive support plan that included housing assistance, mental health treatment, substance abuse counseling, and job training that provided alternatives to the survival strategies that had previously brought him into conflict with the law. Detective Kim's final report documented the successful transition of this individual from repeated arrests to stable housing and employment, noting the specific services and interventions that had been most effective in helping him rebuild his life. The case file would serve as a resource for future situations involving homeless individuals, providing a model for comprehensive responses that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. The Records Completion Center also processed cases that had been resolved through what the department called community accountability processes, where neighborhoods had taken active roles in developing consequences and support systems for individuals who had committed crimes within their communities. These cases required documentation that captured not just official police actions, but also the community involvement that had been essential to successful resolution. Officer Michael Rodriguez was completing files for several cases where community members had chosen to work directly with offenders to address harm and prevent future problems. One case had involved a series of bicycle thefts that had been solved when neighbors had identified a local teenager who had been taking bikes to repair and sell them for money to help his family with rent and grocery expenses, rather than simply having the teenager arrested and prosecuted. The community had worked with police to develop a response that addressed both the harm caused by the thefts and the economic pressures that had motivated them. The teenager had been required to return all stolen bicycles and to work with a local bike shop to learn legitimate repair skills, while also being connected with social services that could help his family access assistance with their financial difficulties. Officer Rodriguez's final documentation showed that the teenager had eventually been hired by the bike shop, where he had been volunteering and had become an advocate for other young people who were struggling with similar economic pressures. The case file contained letters from bicycle owners who had recovered their property, from the bike shop owner who had provided mentorship and employment, and from social workers who had helped the teenager's family stabilize their housing and financial situation. The comprehensive nature of this documentation reflected the department's recognition that effective crime resolution often required understanding and addressing the social context in which criminal behavior occurred. The final case files served not just as records of police activity, but as documentation of community capacity for problem-solving and mutual support. As afternoon moved toward evening, the pace of work in the Records Completion Center gradually slowed, with officers taking time to review their completed files carefully before submitting them for final archival processing. The work of closing cases required the same attention to detail that had characterized the original investigations, ensuring that the permanent record accurately reflected both the facts of what had occurred and the reasoning behind the approaches that had been taken to address each situation. Detective Morrison conducted a final review of all cases that had been completed during the day, checking to ensure that each file contained the documentation necessary for proper archival storage, while also looking for patterns and themes that might inform future training and policy development. Her years of experience had taught her that the process of closing cases provided valuable opportunities for learning and institutional improvement that should not be overlooked in the routine of administrative completion. The files that were completed each day would join thousands of others in the department's archives, becoming part of the permanent record of how law enforcement had functioned during this particular period in the community's history. Future researchers, policymakers, and police officers would consult these records to understand how specific problems had been addressed and what approaches had been most effective in maintaining public safety while preserving community relationships. The cases that were processed through the Records Completion Center represented more than just individual criminal incidents. They were documentation of the ongoing effort to balance law enforcement responsibilities with community needs and human dignity. Each file contained evidence of how police officers, community members, and social service providers had worked together to address problems that threatened public safety while also seeking solutions that strengthened rather than damaged community relationships. As the day shift prepared to end, Detective Morrison reflected on the hundreds of cases that had been completed and archived during her tenure in the Records Completion Center. Each file represented a human story that had intersected with the criminal justice system, but also a community story about how problems had been addressed through cooperation, creativity, and commitment to both justice and healing. The quiet of the late afternoon in the Records Completion Center was the sound of institutional memory being carefully preserved, of lessons learned being documented for future reference, and of human stories being given their proper place in the ongoing narrative of community life and law enforcement practice. The cases that found their final rest in these files had been transformed from active investigations into historical documentation that would inform and guide future efforts to maintain order and safety while preserving the values that made community life meaningful and just. In the fading light that filtered through the tall windows, the completed files waited to be transferred to the permanent archives, where they would join the accumulated wisdom of decades of police work and community collaboration. The crimes that had once disrupted the peace of ordinary life had been investigated, resolved, and documented with care that honored both the victims who had been harmed and the broader community that had been affected by their occurrence. The final silence that settled over the completed cases was not the silence of forgetting, but the silence of proper resolution, where human conflicts had been addressed through systems that sought justice while preserving hope for redemption and community healing. Each archived file represented a small victory for the ongoing human effort to create social systems that could respond to wrongdoing with both accountability and compassion, maintaining order while fostering the kind of community environment where all residents could live with dignity and security. As the Records Completion Center prepared to close for the day, the work of documenting and preserving these stories would continue tomorrow and the day after that, creating a permanent record of how one community had chosen to address the challenges that arose when human behavior conflicted with social norms and legal requirements. The cases that had found their rest in the archives would continue to teach and guide, their lessons preserved in the careful documentation that connected past experience to future possibility. The institutional memory contained in these files represented more than just police work. It was evidence of community capacity for growth, learning, and renewal that made it possible to respond to crime and conflict with approaches that strengthened rather than weakened the social bonds that held civic life together. In the quiet of properly completed documentation, these stories had found their place in the larger narrative of human community that would continue long after the specific incidents they recorded had faded from active memory into the peaceful permanence of well-preserved history. The underground archive stretched deeper than most people knew, extending 3 levels beneath the main police building into chambers that had been carved from bedrock during the original construction nearly a century earlier. Detective Emeritus Margaret Stone descended the narrow stairway with the careful steps of someone who had made this journey countless times over her 47 years of service, carrying with her the keys to sections of the archive that held the oldest and most carefully preserved records in the department's institutional memory. The air grew cooler as she moved, deeper underground, where temperature and humidity were controlled by systems that maintained optimal conditions for the preservation of documents, and evidence that dated back to the department's founding in 1884. The electric lighting was minimal and indirect, designed to prevent degradation of sensitive materials while providing enough illumination for the careful work of archival research and maintenance that brought visitors to these deepest levels of official memory. This was the place where cases came to rest after they had moved through all other stages of investigation, resolution, and documentation. The files stored here had been sealed for decades, their contents considered historically significant, but no longer relevant to active police work. Detective Stone served as the keeper of these records, ensuring their preservation while also serving as guide for the occasional researcher or historian who needed access to the department's most carefully guarded institutional knowledge. The first chamber contained records from the department's earliest decades, when the city had been smaller and police work had been conducted with methods that seemed almost quaint by modern standards. The filing cabinets here were made of heavy oak, their brass fittings darkened with age but still functional after nearly a century of service. Each drawer contained hundreds of files, documenting investigations that had been conducted by officers, whose names were now preserved only in these careful records, and in the cemetery plots where they had been laid to rest generations earlier. Detective Stone pulled a file from the 1890s section, handling the aged paper with the reverence that such historical documents deserved. The case involved the theft of a horse and buggy from outside the First Methodist Church during Sunday services, an incident that had scandalized the small community and had required the full attention of the three-man police force that had served the city during that era. The investigating officer, Constable William Murphy, had documented the case with the careful penmanship that characterized official correspondence from that period, using fountain pen ink that had faded to brown but remained clearly legible after more than a century. His report described not just the facts of the theft, but also the social context that had made such an incident particularly shocking to a community where trust and mutual respect were taken for granted among church-going residents. The case had been solved when the stolen horse had been found grazing in a field outside town, still hitched to the buggy but abandoned by whoever had taken it for what appeared to have been a temporary joyride, rather than a serious attempt at permanent theft. Constable Murphy's investigation had eventually identified the culprit as a visiting salesman who had been drinking at the local tavern and had made an impulsive decision to borrow transportation back to his hotel without considering the legal and social implications of his action. The resolution had been handled with the kind of personal attention that was possible in a small community where everyone knew everyone else. The salesman had been required to make a public apology to the church congregation and to pay for the care and feeding of the horse during the period when its owner had been deprived of its use. The incident had become part of local folklore, told and retold as an example of the foolishness that could result from combining alcohol with poor judgment. Detective Stone returned the file to its proper place and moved deeper into the archive, where cases from the early 20th century documented the city's growth and the increasing complexity of police work as urban population expanded and social problems became more diverse and challenging. These files showed the evolution of investigative techniques and the gradual development of professional standards that had transformed policing from a largely informal community role into a specialized career requiring extensive training and institutional support. In the 1920s section, she found files related to prohibition enforcement, a period when local police had been required to enforce federal laws that many community members considered unjust and unworkable. The cases from this era documented the tensions between legal requirements and community sentiment, showing how officers had attempted to maintain order while navigating the complex political and social pressures that had characterized this controversial period in American history. One file contained reports from Detective James Chun, who had been assigned to investigate illegal alcohol sales in the downtown business district. His careful documentation revealed the challenges of enforcing laws that lacked broad community support, as business owners and residents had often been more cooperative with bootleggers than with police officers who were trying to shut down operations that many people considered legitimate responses to unreasonable government restrictions. Detective Chun's reports showed how he had attempted to balance legal requirements with community relations, focusing his enforcement efforts on operations that involved violence or exploitation while taking a more lenient approach to small-scale activities that served local residents without creating broader social problems. His approach had been controversial within the department, but had been successful in maintaining public trust and cooperation during a period when many police departments had lost credibility due to heavy-handed enforcement of unpopular laws. The Archive's 1930s section documented the impact of the Great Depression on police work, showing how economic hardship had created new types of crime while also generating community solidarity that had helped address many problems through mutual aid and cooperation rather than formal law enforcement. Cases from this era showed families and neighborhoods working together to address theft, vandalism, and other problems that had resulted from widespread unemployment and poverty. Detective Stone found reports from this period that documented innovative approaches to property crime, including cases where communities had organized work programs that provided employment for people who might otherwise have turned to theft for survival. These programs had been coordinated with police departments, but had relied primarily on community resources and volunteer labor rather than government funding or formal social services. One particularly moving case from 1934 had involved a series of food thefts from local markets, investigated by Officer Susan Rodriguez, who had discovered that the thefts were being committed by children whose families had been unable to afford adequate nutrition for several months. Rather than arresting the children, Officer Rodriguez had worked with market owners and community organizations to establish a food distribution program that had provided emergency assistance to struggling families while also addressing the immediate problem of theft. The program had eventually evolved into a permanent food bank that had served the community for decades, with some of the children who had originally been caught stealing eventually becoming volunteers and organizers who helped distribute food to other families facing economic hardship. Officer Rodriguez's careful documentation had preserved not just the facts of the original thefts, but also the process by which community members had transformed a criminal justice problem into an opportunity for ongoing mutual aid and social support. Moving into the archive's deepest section, Detective Stone found herself among files from the 1940s and 1950s, when the city had experienced rapid growth and social change that had required new approaches to maintaining order and community cohesion. These cases documented the challenges of policing increasingly diverse neighborhoods, where different cultural groups had sometimes come into conflict over use of public spaces, business practices, and social customs. The files from this period showed police officers serving as mediators and cultural translators, helping different community groups understand each other's perspectives and find ways to coexist peacefully despite their differences. Many cases had been resolved through community meetings and cultural exchanges rather than through formal legal proceedings, creating precedents for multicultural community relations that had influenced police practice for decades. One file from 1947 contained reports from Detective Robert Kim, who had investigated a series of conflicts between established residents and recent immigrants over use of a neighborhood park. The conflicts had involved different expectations about appropriate recreational activities, noise levels, and supervision of children, leading to complaints and tensions that had threatened to escalate into more serious confrontations. Detective Kim's investigation had revealed that the conflicts were based largely on misunderstandings and different cultural practices rather than fundamental disagreements about community values. He had organized a series of community meetings where different groups had been able to explain their perspectives and learn about each other's traditions and concerns. The resolution had involved developing shared guidelines for park use that accommodated different cultural practices while also ensuring that all community members felt welcome and safe in public spaces. The process had led to the establishment of annual cultural festivals that had celebrated the diversity of the neighborhood, while also building relationships between different groups that had prevented future conflicts. As evening approached in the world above, Detective Stone continued her quiet work in the deep archive. Surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations of police officers who had dedicated their careers to understanding human behavior and maintaining community peace. The files that surrounded her represented more than just criminal investigations. They were documentation of the ongoing human effort to create systems of justice and order that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their fundamental commitment to protecting all community members. The deepest section of the archive contained files that were considered too sensitive or historically significant for general access. Cases that had shaped department policy or had involved prominent community members, whose privacy continued to be protected even decades after their deaths. Detective Stone's role as keeper of these records required not just administrative skill but also the judgment to determine when historical significance outweighed privacy concerns and when access should be granted to researchers and officials who could benefit from studying these carefully. Preserved examples of police work. The temperature in the deep archive remained constant throughout the year, creating an environment where time seemed suspended and the normal rhythms of daily life gave way to the eternal quiet of properly preserved history. Detective Stone found this environment conducive to reflection and contemplation, allowing her to consider the patterns and themes that connected individual cases into larger stories about community development and social change. The files that rested in these climate-controlled chambers represented the final destination for human stories that had once generated intense emotion and urgent activity but had eventually found their proper place in the larger narrative of community life and institutional memory. Each case had been someone's crisis or tragedy, but time and careful resolution had transformed them into lessons and guidance that continued to inform police work and community relations. As she prepared to complete her daily rounds of the deep archive, Detective Stone reflected on the privilege of serving as guardian for these institutional memories. The cases that surrounded her had been investigated by officers who had brought their own perspectives and limitations to their work, but who had also demonstrated remarkable creativity and compassion in addressing human problems that had no easy solutions. The archive would continue to preserve these stories long after Detective Stone had retired and joined the ranks of officers whose work was documented in these same files. Future generations of police officers and community leaders would consult these records to understand how previous challenges had been addressed and what approaches had been most effective in maintaining public safety while preserving community trust and cooperation. In the eternal quiet of the deep archive, where the work of decades had been distilled into carefully organized and preserved documentation, the stories of crime and resolution had found their final rest. The cases that filled these chambers had been transformed from active investigations into institutional wisdom that would guide future efforts to maintain order and justice in a world where human conflicts would continue to arise, but could be addressed through the accumulated knowledge of those who had faced similar challenges in earlier times. The silence that surrounded these archived cases was the silence of work completed and lessons learned, where human drama had been resolved and documented with care that honored both the individuals involved and the broader community that had been affected by their actions. In this deepest sanctuary of institutional memory, the stories had found the peace that came only when justice had been pursued with both firmness and compassion, creating records that would endure as evidence of humanity's ongoing effort to create systems of order that served the common good while protecting individual dignity and community harmony. The Night Watch Division operated from the top floor of the old precinct building, where large windows offered views of the sleeping city spread out below, like a vast map of quiet streets and softly glowing windows. Lieutenant Catherine Hayes had overseen the midnight shift for 12 years, understanding that police work during the deepest hours of night required different skills and sensibilities than the more visible activities that characterized daytime law enforcement. The officers who worked the night watch were chosen for their patience and ability to work independently, handling calls that came in during the hours when most support services were closed and when problems often required creative solutions that couldn't wait for normal business hours. The pace was slower, but the responsibility was greater, as night shift officers often found themselves serving as counselors, mediators, and community problem solvers in addition to their traditional law enforcement duties. Officer David Martinez sat at his desk completing a report about a call that had come in 2:47 a.m. from the Riverside nursing home, where a staff member had reported that one of the residents had been found wandering in the parking lot in his pajamas, confused and unable to remember how he had gotten outside. The incident had required careful handling, as it involved both immediate safety concerns and longer-term questions about the adequacy of care being provided to vulnerable elderly residents. Officer Martinez had responded to find Mr. Albert Chun, an 86-year-old man with moderate dementia, sitting on a bench near the nursing home entrance, wearing only lightweight pajamas despite the cool October night. Mr. Chun had been coherent enough to give his name, but had been unable to explain how he had left his room or why he had been outside, creating concerns about both his immediate well-being and the security procedures at the facility. The investigation had required Officer Martinez to interview night shift nursing staff, review security protocols, and examine the physical layout of the facility to understand how a resident with cognitive impairment had been able to leave the building undetected. The nursing home administrator had been contacted despite the late hour, as the incident raised questions about patient safety that required immediate attention and followed up. Officer Martinez's report documented not just the immediate resolution of the incident, which had involved safely returning Mr. Chun to his room and ensuring that he received medical evaluation to check for any effects of cold exposure, but also the systemic issues that had been identified and the steps taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. The nursing home had agreed to review and strengthen their security procedures, including the installation of additional monitoring equipment and the modification of staff protocols to ensure more frequent checks on residents who were at risk of wandering. Officer Martinez had also connected the facility with resources for staff, training about managing dementia-related behaviors, and had arranged for follow-up visits to ensure that promised improvements were actually implemented. At the desk beside him, Officer Patricia Wong was documenting a domestic disturbance call that had required several hours of careful mediation to resolve without arrests or ongoing court involvement. The call had come from an apartment complex on the east side of town, where neighbors had reported loud arguing and the sound of objects being thrown. When Officer Wong had arrived at the scene, she had found a young couple, Maria and Carlos Santos, engaged in an argument that had escalated beyond their ability to resolve through normal communication. The argument had been triggered by financial stress related to Carlos's recent job loss, but Officer Wong's patient listening had revealed deeper relationship issues that required more than simple conflict de-escalation. Maria had been working double shifts to compensate for Carlos's lost income, leaving her exhausted and resentful, while Carlos had been struggling with depression and feelings of inadequacy that had made him defensive and prone to angry outbursts. Their argument had been about immediate financial decisions, but the underlying tension had been building for weeks as they had tried to cope with economic pressure without adequate communication or support. Officer Wong had spent more than 2 hours helping the couple identify the real sources of their conflict and develop strategies for addressing both their immediate financial crisis and their longer-term relationship challenges. She had connected them with employment counseling services for Carlos, stress management resources for Maria, and couples counseling options that could help them improve their communication skills. The resolution had also involved practical problem solving, including information about emergency financial assistance programs and community resources that could help them manage their housing and utility costs while Carlos searched for new employment. Officer Wong's report documented not just the successful de-escalation of the immediate conflict, but also the comprehensive support network that had been mobilized to address the underlying problems that had created the crisis. The Night Watch approach to domestic disturbances emphasized prevention and family preservation whenever possible, recognizing that arrests and prosecution often worsened family problems rather than resolving them. Officer Wong's patient work with the Santos family represented the kind of community policing that required significant time investment, but often prevented future calls and strengthened family stability. Lieutenant Hayes made her rounds through the Night Watch office, checking on the progress of various cases and offering assistance with situations that required supervisory input or coordination with other agencies. Her experience had taught her that effective night shift policing required officers who could work autonomously while also knowing when to seek additional resources or expertise. Officer Michael Kim was working on documentation for a case that had involved what initially appeared to be a break-in at the downtown library, but had turned out to be a much more complex situation involving a homeless individual who had been seeking shelter and access to resources rather than attempting to commit theft or vandalism. The incident had been discovered during a routine security check when a patrol officer had noticed lights on in the library building during hours when it should have been closed and locked. Investigation had revealed that someone had found a way to enter the building and had been using the space for several hours, but without causing any apparent damage or taking any library property. Officer Kim had found the individual, a middle-aged woman named Jennifer Walsh, sleeping in a corner of the reading room, surrounded by books about job searching and social services. She had been homeless for several weeks following an eviction, and had been using the library as a quiet place to research resources and apply for assistance programs, but had been unable to complete her applications during normal library hours due to time limits on computer use and the complexity of the Tidal paperwork involved. Rather than treating the incident as simple trespassing, Officer Kim had recognized that Ms. Walsh's situation represented a broader problem with the availability of social services during hours when people who were experiencing homelessness could actually access them. He had worked with her to identify immediate shelter options while also connecting her with daytime social workers who could help her complete applications for housing assistance and other programs. The case had also led to conversations with library staff about ways to better serve patrons who were experiencing homelessness, including extended computer time for job searching and assistance with navigating social service applications. Officer Kim's report documented both the immediate resolution of the trespassing incident and the systemic changes that had been implemented to address the underlying service gaps that had contributed to the problem. The night watch office maintained a quiet atmosphere that was conducive to the thoughtful police work that many overnight calls required. The reduced radio traffic and absence of administrative distractions allowed out officers to focus more carefully on the human aspects of the situations they encountered, often leading to more creative and comprehensive solutions than might be possible during busier daylight hours. Officer Susan Rodriguez was completing paperwork for a noise complaint that had evolved into a community mediation success story. The initial call had come from a resident who complained about loud music coming from a nearby house, but Officer Rodriguez's investigation had revealed cultural differences in communication, barriers that required sensitive handling rather than simple enforcement of noise ordinances. The house in question was occupied by a large extended family that had recently immigrated from Guatemala, and their evening gatherings represented important cultural traditions that helped maintain family bonds and cultural identity in their new community. The complaining neighbor was an elderly man who worked early morning shifts and needed quiet during evening hours, but who had not felt comfortable approaching the family directly due to language barriers and cultural unfamiliarity. Officer Rodriguez had served as a cultural mediator, helping both parties understand each other's perspectives and needs, while working together to develop a solution that respected the family's cultural practices while also addressing the neighbor's legitimate need for quiet during his sleeping hours. The resolution had involved scheduling family gatherings for earlier in the evening and using interior rooms for activities that might generate noise. More importantly, the mediation process had led to ongoing communication between neighbors who had previously been strangers. The elderly neighbor had learned about Guatemalan culture and had even been invited to participate in some family celebrations, while the immigrant family had gained a better understanding of neighborhood customs and had connected with community resources that helped them navigate other aspects of life in their new home. Officer Rodriguez's report documented not just the immediate resolution of the noise complaint, but also the ongoing positive relationships that had developed between neighbors from different cultural backgrounds. The case had become a model for addressing cultural conflicts through education and communication rather than enforcement and separation. As the night progressed toward dawn, the pace of activity in the night watch office gradually increased as officers prepared to brief their day shift counterparts about ongoing cases and situations that would require continued attention. The transition between shifts was always carefully managed to ensure continuity of service and to make sure that important information was properly communicated to officers who would be handling follow-up activities. Officer Angela Thompson was finalizing a report about a missing person case that had been resolved through community cooperation and persistent investigation. The case had involved a teenage girl who had not returned home from school, prompting a search that had involved not just police officers, but also school personnel, neighborhood volunteers, and family members who had worked together to locate her safely. The teenager, 15-year-old Sarah Martinez, had been struggling with family conflicts and had decided to spend the night with a friend without informing her parents of her plans. The miscommunication had created panic and had prompted an extensive search effort that had involved multiple agencies and dozens of volunteers who had searched parks, abandoned buildings, and other locations where a missing teenager might seek shelter. Officer Thompson had coordinated the search effort while also investigating the family situation that had contributed to Sarah's decision to leave home without permission. The investigation had revealed ongoing tensions between Sarah and her parents related to academic pressure, social restrictions, and communication difficulties that had made home feel unwelcoming and stressful. The resolution had involved not just locating Sarah and ensuring her safe return home, but also facilitating family counseling and communication improvement that addressed the underlying issues that had motivated her disappearance. Officer Thompson had connected the family with resources for teen-parent mediation and had arranged for ongoing support to help them develop healthier patterns of communication and conflict resolution. The case had demonstrated the importance of community involvement in addressing problems that affected young people, as the search effort had revealed a network of caring adults who were willing to support teenagers and families who were struggling with communication and relationship challenges. As the first light of dawn began to appear in the windows of the night watch office, Lieutenant Hayes reflected on another successful shift of community-oriented policing that had addressed human problems with patience, creativity, and respect for the dignity of all involved parties. The cases that had been handled during the overnight hours would be carefully documented and filed, becoming part of the department's institutional memory while also contributing to the ongoing effort to serve the community's needs through law enforcement that prioritized problem-solving over punishment. The night watch officers prepared to end their shift with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized their work throughout the night, knowing that their patient attention to human needs and community relationships had contributed to the safety and well-being of residents, who would soon be waking up to begin another day in a community where problems were addressed through cooperation and understanding rather than force and authority. The reports they had completed would join thousands of others in documenting how law enforcement could serve community needs through approaches that honored both public safety and human dignity, creating records that would guide future officers in continuing the work of maintaining order and justice through methods that strengthened, rather than damaged, the social fabric that made community life possible.